Inspiring You Show. And if we haven't met, I'm Henry. This is the April Energy Forecast 2026. Reality begins to move in response to your true signal alignment after recognition. So, my friends, whether you are listening live, receiving the replay, or simply opening to the light transmission through presence, your field is already participating. You're not arriving from the outside. You're not trying to enter something you missed. If your soul said yes, you are already in correspondence. You're already within the field. You're already being met. And this space honors your sovereignty. Nothing is imposed, nothing is pushed. Only what is aligned and beneficial supports your field. So, if you are new to me, I walk the path of energy, intuitive and multidimensional channels, supporting harmonic embodiment, crystalline coherence, and presence led structural light truth. So, if you are also listening to the public version on the podcast or YouTube, you may hear references to crystalline dowsing and Reiki energy healing session that goes along with this energy forecast. And that full multidimensional clearing and recalibration is available exclusively for the Inspiring You All Access Patreon members. If you feel called into the deeper work, the link will be in the show notes. Okay, let us begin with a breath, my friends. So let's inhale, allowing the field to meet you exactly where you are. And then exhale. Release the impulse to adjust your tone in order to be met. And let's do this again. Inhale, exhale. Okay, my friends. First, let's welcome April. Hello, April. Welcoming April in. Take another deep breath. And let's begin. April no longer speaks only in the language of recognition. It speaks in the language of response beginning. So, where March revealed the stabilized light format as externally legible, April is the first month where the external field begins responding to what is stabilized within you. So, this is not the threshold itself, it is the first movement after threshold, the moment when recognition has already occurred and response begins to form. Nothing fully reorganizes yet, nothing completes itself yet, nothing settles into final form. Instead, April opens the first response layer of the arc. So the light format meets the external field through early correspondence without performance, without self judgment, without abandoning soul tone, without requiring translation in order to be met. So that means you are letting go of performing coherence. Then your coherence becomes in more available and begins to generate response. So this month shifts the nervous system out of treating recognition as the end point. Neutrality becomes structural receiving, not internal steadiness alone. Contact becomes clearer because the field begins responding with greater accuracy. So contradiction softens because mixed signaling loses momentum. So, where March revealed your internal tone to the external field, and when we're talking about internal tone, we're talking about soul tone because you can have mixed signals, which we talked about last month, where you can have mixed signals. You can have a non beneficial survival signal, which then could be blocking possibly your actual soul signal, your soul tone. And then the external field could be actually responding to that non beneficial survival signal, which is why it's really beneficial to do energy work to clear, recalibrate, and really strengthen your connection to your soul tone. So, where March revealed your inner internal tone to the external field, and again, soul tone, April reveals how the tone begins generating response. And this is what we want the soul tone begins generating response. So then with the soul tone, you're not trying to be understood. Reality begins moving in response to your soul signal. And this is the quiet bridge between external recognition and the deeper alignment arc where the field begins reorganizing through light, truthful response. So, with that, then the overall theme for April 2026 energy forecast is reality begins to move in response to your true signal, alignment after recognition. So, again, your true signal is your soul signal. And the embodiment key for this is arc of field alignment from external registration to early structural correspondence. And then, in terms of the arc context, we are under the arc of structural residency format year 2, becoming legible to the field without adjusting tone. And so April is not a month of becoming visible. It is the month of beginning to be met. Where March invited the world to read what had stabilized within you, April introduces the moment when the world begins responding to what it has now learned to read. Again, this is not the threshold itself. It is the first movement after the threshold, the quiet arc where response begins. But full reorganization has not taken shape yet. Nothing fully resolves yet. Nothing completely restructures yet. Nothing settles into finished alignment. Instead, April opens new energetic function. The light format meets the external field through response, through correspondence, and through the first movements of light, truthful contact. So, this month teaches you how it feels when the field begins answering your true signal, your soul signal, without requiring you to translate, perform, or reshape yourself in order to be met. Because when you are shifting, or trying to modulate yourself to translate or perform or reshape yourself in order to be met, then you might be going into non-beneficial survival as opposed as opposed to being in your true soul tone. So, the nervous system no longer waits for recognition as though it were an endpoint. The field no longer positions itself according to old survival based feedback, or the field is letting go of doing so more so because sometimes it's not like an instant happening. And there are many layers that you may be going through in terms of clearing and recalibrating. And then structural residency is no longer only inward, it's beginning to generate response. So you're not trying to be coherent, you are coherent. And for the first time, reality begins responding to that. So April is subtle by design then. The shifts are precise, quiet, foundational because response must begin before reorganization can take form. So, just as March externalized the architecture, April begins to show how the architecture is answered by the field. And this is the month where you may notice your tone, again, your soul tone, is met with more accurate response in certain interactions. Some people or environments begin responding more to the light truth you actually hold. Support appears in smaller but more light truthful forms. Patterns of contradiction appear with less force or resolve more quickly. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about non beneficial patterns. And then the external field begins responding to your stabilized soul tone with increasing clarity, larger movements, even if its larger movements have not yet fully taken shape. So, you may notice you're not over explaining yourself as much. You're not adjusting your tone in order to be received. You're not reaching for external movement to confirm what you already know. You're not absorbing others' response in the way you once did. You're not leaving your own structure in order to manage what is happening around you. Not because you're withdrawing, but because your structure is finally holding its shape in contact. And structure, we're really talking about, your light format, your ability to hold your soul tone without trying to shape or shape shift into modulation and connect more so to your non-beneficial survival signal where you're actually able to maintain your human is able to maintain the connectedness to your soul. And so because your structure is finally holding its own shape and contact, the field is beginning to answer that shape more truthfully. And that's where sometimes it takes patience as well in terms of the field answering you. And and so then April, and we're really talking about internal field and external field because If you're not able to hold your soul tone, it affects obviously your internal field, and then your internal field then connecting to the external field, and then how you're being read in terms of the external field. So April reveals how your coherence begins generating response, how it is met, reflected, answered by the external world. And so, with this, one thing to remember is you're not trying to be met. Reality is quietly starting to meet you. And so, that's really the overall theme. This is the beginning of the bridge between what the world recognized in March and how the world begins responding in April. The outer field, the external field had to register your stabilized light format architecture in March before it could begin responding to it in April. And so it's the first response layer of the arc. It's a month where the light format is answered, not pursued, beginning to be met. Your soul tone is beginning to stand more so on its own. Your soul signal is beginning to generate more correspondence. Your field becomes then consequential. And then this consequence is the precursor to the alignment that follows. Okay, so then within this overall theme, there are 9 themes. So this month's theme is held within the harmonic umbrella of all these 9 April themes we're going to talk about. Each theme describes a different way stabilized light format begins generating response within the external field. These are not new constructions, they're early expressions of how coherence it begins becoming consequential. And so rather than building something additional, the April themes reveal how life subtly shifts when the world begins responding to your true tone. And your true tone, your soul tone is what we're talking about. So some themes illuminate how contact changes as the external field begins answering your soul signal more accurately. Others show how systems relate differently when it is no longer waiting for recognition as though recognition were the end point. Some themes highlight the softening of old patterns, not as completion, but as signs that contradiction, delay, and adaptive response are losing authority. Together, these themes are not separate teachings, they are facets of a single lived structure beginning to generate correspondence. So think of the 9 themes as functional expressions rather than sequential steps. They are residency markers, signs that stabilized light format is being lived more fully within the individual field. Response points, early movements where the external field begins answering what has become legible. Discernment surfaces, places where relational and environmental light truth becomes easier to feel. Support pathways, moments where response begins appearing through fit, resonance, and light truthful meeting. Alignment thresholds, subtle shifts where what was recognized begins to be met. Nothing artificial is being initiated, nothing is being forced into motion. What is already stabilized is simply beginning to generate response. That is why the April themes move through contact, support, discernment, early alignment. They do not ask you to create movement, they reveal how coherence begins organizing how the world responds to you. April is the month where the soul does not merely become readable, it begins to be met. You're standing in the space where correspondence begins to form. April is the month where your architecture does not change, the field's response begins to. So, with that, take a nice deep breath. Also, just note the energy. We have really shifted into that quantum feel, that real deep peace, coherence feel. Or as you might also say 5D, whatever you call it, that it just has a certain quality of just this depth of real peaceful coherence and is this real deep stillness. All right. Let's go to theme number 1 now. Theme number 1 is structural residency deepens. Your individual field stops rechecking its coherence your individual field stops rechecking its coherence. So I will say this though, it doesn't mean it's immediately stopping. It's beginning to, maybe for some maybe it's already stopped. And so depending on where you can be within this, the subline is stabilization becomes more fully lived as an ongoing state rather than something constantly monitored. And so then the harmonic function is its internal residency lock. And with this, the individual field, it's about stabilized light form. It becomes more fully lived as a governing state rather than something repeatedly checked, repaired, or reestablished. But that, again, that does not mean that you are fully there yet. So just know that this is something that, like, setting an intention for some may already be there. We all can be in different places. And then with this, for the external field, it encounters a more consistent soul signal and begins meeting a tone that is less interrupted by internal self monitoring or less interrupted by the non beneficial survival signal. Okay, so structural residency deepens means your field is learning to live from coherence rather than repeatedly checking whether coherence is still there. So, this theme is about the stabilization of internal residency. It addresses the shift from maintaining your structure through constant monitoring, recalibrating, self checking, or repeated reentry into actually inhabiting what is already stabilized as a governing state. For many people, even after meaningful inner stabilization has occurred, there can still be a habit of returning to the beginning. The field keeps checking whether it is still aligned, still coherent, still safe, still steady, still there. And by the field, it's I'm saying the field, but it's, the human, it could be the mental body. It could also be maybe emotions are processing. There can be many aspects to this because you're multidimensional. So, but nonetheless, that pattern may seem subtle, but it creates interruption. It places part of the system in ongoing self monitoring rather than in full residency. So, in this theme, the guides are showing that April begins by deepening structural trust. Your individual field is no longer being asked to stabilize itself again from the beginning, it's being asked to live from what has already stabilized. So, that is the shift. Coherence becomes less of a state you keep trying to confirm and more of a structure you begin inhabiting with greater continuity. So, as this happens, the soul signal becomes less interrupted by self monitoring in the external field, begins meeting a tone that is more consistent, less internally broken up by constant checking. And by that, meeting a tone, meeting the soul tone. So then April begins with that deepening. Instead of circling back to repair what is not actually broken, the field begins releasing the reflex to repeatedly reassess whether it is allowed to stay in coherence. You do not have to start over each time you enter a room, a conversation, a decision, or a new layer of contact. You do not have to keep proving stabilization to yourself in order to remain inside. You begin living from the light format that is already stabilized instead of repeatedly orienting toward it as though it still needs to be established. That is the shift. Structural residency becomes more fully lived. Your field becomes less occupied with internal confirmation and more available to remain in its own governing tone, in its own soul tone. That is why this theme is called Structural Residency Deepens. Light in physical form. Your light is in structural residency and it deepens. So the emphasis is not just on stabilization itself, the emphasis is on whether stabilization has become embodied enough to function as a governing state in regard to your human, your multidimensional aspect. So the more your field stops rechecking its coherence, the more continuity becomes possible. And this creates a major structural shift in how your tone is held and how it's met. The soul signal becomes more consistent because there is less interruption from internal repair patterns, non beneficial patterns, possibly also from going into the non beneficial survival signal. And with that, then when the soul signal becomes more consistent because there's less interruption, the external field begins encountering a tone that is more steadily present, and it begins encountering your soul tone. So just imagine the external field is now encountering your soul tone more steadily as opposed to a non beneficial survival signal. Just imagine how that would possibly then support you and also shape the reality that you are in. So, why this matters. This theme matters in April because the month is not beginning from instability, it's beginning from what has already been built. The guides are showing that earlier phases were necessary for stabilization, for strengthening the light format, for reducing internal fragmentation, and for building greater structural residency. If you are in the Inspiring You Patreon meditate with me classes and also the all access dowsing, we have been doing a ton in regard to stabilization, strengthening the light format, reducing internal fragmentation, building structural residency. And we've been talking a lot about these different, words and then putting them into practice, whether it's through the Meditate with Me classes or in the all access where we are right now in the process of doing the 28 sessions of clearing non beneficial survival, shifting into thriving, and then also the third part of the abundance dowsing process just came out last month, which that in and of itself took me about over 60 hours to do. And it's just so thorough. But all of that helps clearing and reducing internal fragmentation, building structural residency, and really supporting in terms of connecting to your soul signal, your soul tone. Okay, but now though, this month, the work is different. April is not primarily about creating coherence from scratch. It is about trusting coherence enough to live from it. And one of the reasons why I will sometimes often say, like, oh, wait, the energy just shifted. Can you feel the coherence, the stillness? There is, for me, it's almost like it just clicks in and it's this real depth of the stillness and this coherence. And so that's part of it about trusting coherence to live from it, where you're then recognizing the discernment of it. And so that is part of it, just really taking note of it. And so it's trusting the coherence enough to live from it. And the distinction matters because a field can be stabilized and still behave as though it must continuously reestablish its own integrity. So I'm going to just repeat that. So it is about trusting coherence enough to live from it. And that distinction matters because a field can be stabilized and still behave as though it must continuously reestablish its own integrity. So basically, it's looping. And when that happens, part of the signal remains occupied by self monitoring rather than in full presence. And that can create a subtle interruption because, like, half of you can be there, but maybe half of you is monitoring. And so the system may keep pausing to check itself. It may be scanning for whether it has lost its state. It may be scanning, am I really safe? It may be repeating internal repair movements even when the structure is already holding. So it may assume that every new movement requires a new round of stabilization. These habits are understandable. They often come from phases where the field genuinely was still learning how to hold continuity. And so they could have been beneficial at one point, but now they've come to completion. So in April, the guides are showing the internal architecture, the light format architecture has matured enough for a new assignment. Stay in what holds. So this matters because the external field can only respond clearly to what remains consistent enough to be met. So if you have been consistent more so in a non beneficial survival signal, the external field, is responding to that. If your tone is repeatedly interrupted by internal rechecking, the signal the outer world encounters becomes less continuous. And April then gives an opportunity, begin softening that pattern so your field can move from stabilized structure into lived residency. So that able to live in that lived residency. So, how this may feel in terms of the human, this theme may feel less internal effort being required just to remain yourself. You may notice that you're not having to reorient in the same way every time something moves around you. You may feel, less compulsion to check whether you're still aligned, still clear, or still stable. You may become you may become aware of how often you used to pause inwardly to verify your own coherence before moving, speaking, or receiving. You may begin feeling more naturalness around simply staying where you already are. So this can be really subtle. It may show up as less internal backtracking, less need to correct yourself before contact, less feeling that every moment requires a fresh energetic reset. It could also mean less anxiety about whether your coherence has held. So, more capacity to remain inside your actual soul tone without continuously monitoring it. So, this theme, so just think of this also this way, where if you have some past lives where you weren't safe, that's part of the monitoring where it could be subconscious, where you're like, wait, am I really safe? And you may then it may be a habit of then going invisible and moving into the non beneficial survival signal because it may be a habit. It may be something from a past life where you weren't safe to be seen. And now that fear and anxiety is still there, connected to this possible subconscious thought forms from a past life, connected to these non-beneficial patterns of monitoring, which then is creating you to move from soul signal into non-beneficial survival signal. And like we talked about last month, you can have dual signaling happening. You can have a non beneficial survival signal and your soul signal happening at once. And the field, the external field, your field, is only going to be replying to the one that is the strongest. And if you have put more work into the non beneficial survival signal, that may be strongest because then the thought process might be there in terms of the narrative, the emotions that haven't processed yet and completed. And that's why it's really important to, in doing this work, you're doing it from a multidimensional perspective. You're working in the present life. What is happening in the present? Okay, is this connected only to the present? Is this connected to the past lives? Is this connected to the ancestral field? Is this connected to anything in the collective? What is being called to be cleared, shifted, and recalibrated? And there is a feeling when you have cleared and shifted and recalibrated, where you feel like you are, you might feel like you're caught in something, and then all of a sudden that clears and you're like, oh, I'm no longer caught in that net, that web. And you feel maybe lighter, more grounded. There's a lot of different things that can happen in a clearing and recalibration, but mostly people tend to feel a lot lighter. You feel more in clarity. And so but that again is why it's so important to like use the tools and where am I in the experience? What is really happening in understanding how the mental body works, the emotional body, the physical body, and the also then in terms of what past lives, if you're seeing images from past lives and not getting so caught up in the glamorizing moment of like, wow, this is so cool, which it is really cool when you're like, oh my God, I just saw like a past life. That is really cool. I don't want to take away from the joy of that because it is. Yet you want to take that information. It's information, it's data. You want to then utilize it in terms of, okay, why did it just come up? And what's happening with it? What is it trying to tell me? And it might be because there's something from a past life that's non beneficially like influencing this present life, or if you will, it's being called to complete in this present life, and the wisdom downloaded. So that's why the multidimensional tools are so important. Okay, so this theme though, this theme 1, it may also bring up tenderness because some part of the system may still believe that if it stops checking, it will lose itself. And again, that could be something from past lives where, maybe you did that in a past life and something not so great happened in that past life. And then there's fear. And that's why you have to address these possibilities. The guides are also showing that this is part of what is being updated. The field is learning that coherence is not maintained only through vigilance. It can be maintained through residency. It can hold because it becomes more structurally true, not because you're constantly watching it. And I also just want to say the guides do bring in new language or how we're using certain words, because some of the words that are in the past, they may have been beneficial at one point, but now they may hold they just might hold different types of energy, or they could hold us in a space that's more locked in. So when they're bringing in words that are essentially new in a different way, it allows us then to bring in more of, the light information, and kind of unhooks us possibly from non-beneficial patterns and programs. Okay, so energetically speaking, this internal residency lock. So, energetically, and just to kind of connect again to this theme, we're talking about theme number 1, which is structural residency deepens. Your individual field stops rechecking its coherence. And so, what does that mean in regard to, energetically speaking? Energetically, this theme is about the light format becoming more operational as a lived state rather than as a structure that still requires frequent conscious reentry. So when internal residency is not yet fully locked, the field may oscillate between coherence and monitoring. It may touch the stabilized state and then check it. It may enter the true tone, the soul tone, then verify it. It may hold alignment and then scan for whether it is still intact. So this pattern can create a subtle stop start rhythm in the signal. The soul tone is present, but part of the field remains engaged in maintenance mode. So theme 1 begins reducing that rhythm. As structural residency deepens, the field becomes more willing to remain in place without repeatedly referencing instability as its orienting point. The light format does not disappear, but it begins functioning with less interruption. This is what makes the soul signal more consistent. The field starts holding its tone with greater continuity because less energy is being used to reestablish what is already there. And when we're talking about the field starts holding its soul tone with greater continuity because less energy is being used to reestablish what's already there, or less energy is being used to move into that non-beneficial survival signal. So then with this, you may notice energetic signs of this. Less internal stop start around coherence, less compulsion to scan whether the field is still holding, more continuity in your soul signal across different environments, less interruption from self monitoring before contact, greater trust in the stability of your field, more ease in remaining in the light format without repeated recalibration, a stronger sense that coherence is now a place you live from, not a place you keep trying to get back to. That does not mean awareness disappears. It means vigilance stops functioning as the main way coherence is maintained. And so with this too, this is all part of it is just practice. And that's part of when we do meditate with me, we're really practicing. So that way, once we step out of those meditation practice, we can start living from that. And it is, I know sometimes we want it to be insta fast. It is a process. So be patient with the process. All right. Here's a message from Oversoul Stream of Sahariel. What is deepening here is not only your coherence, it is your willingness to stop treating coherence as temporary. The field has learned many ways of preserving itself through monitoring, checking, revisiting, reestablishing. Those movements were once helpful when continuity was still forming, but they are not the final form of residency. There comes a point where the structure is stable enough that returning to the beginning becomes a form of interruption rather than support. And that is what April begins revealing. You're not being asked to abandon awareness. You're being asked to stop using self monitoring in regard to the non beneficial aspect as your primary proof of stability. Your light format is becoming more livable. Your soul tone is becoming more inhabitable. The governing state no longer needs to be rebuilt each time life moves around you. It can remain, it can continue, it can hold without being repeatedly restarted. Let yourself live inside what has already become true. This is one of the ways the field becomes readable enough for alignment to begin. So that's the end of Oversoul Sahariel's message about theme one. All right, let's take a nice deep breath on that. Okay, let's move into an example. So here's an example. You move into a conversation, a work task, a decision, or a relational space. In the past, part of your field may have automatically paused to check itself. Am I aligned? Am I clear? Am I in my true tone? Do I need to recalibrate before I proceed? That internal movement may have been quick, almost invisible. You may be doing it completely subconsciously, but it interrupted continuity. Now something different begins to happen. You enter the moment without having to start over. You remain in your own field without repeated reestablishment. You do not need to prove yourself. You do not need to prove to yourself that your coherence is present before you can use it. You simply live from it. And because of that, your soul signal becomes more continuous. The outer field, the external field, is not only meeting moments of coherence, it's meeting a soul tone that remains more steadily present. And that is part of the gift of this theme. And also just note the energy. We've really shifted even more so into that quantum feel, that coherence, that deep, deep stillness. Okay, so what this theme builds in April. So this theme builds the foundation of the whole month. April begins by asking the field to live from what has already stabilized rather than continuing to treat stabilization as unfinished. Theme one matters because everything else in April depends on this continuity. If the field is still repeatedly interrupting itself through internal checking, then legibility, response, and alignment remains more fragmented. But when structural residency deepens, the soul signal, the signal the outer field encounters becomes more stable. And that's the soul signal that you want to the outer field becoming more stable, more readable, and less modified by the self monitoring or by the non beneficial survival signal. So this theme helps the field. It moves from stabilization into lived residency. It reduces the habit of repeated internal rechecking. It allows the light format to function more fully as essentially the governing state. It also strengthens continuity of soul signal across contact and movement. It prepares the external field to meet a tone that is less interrupted and more consistent. The external field gets to meet your soul tone more so than your non-beneficial survival one. Can you imagine that difference? So this is essential for April because the month is not about rebuilding coherence. It's about letting coherence become stable enough to be lived, read, and responded to. And so the questions this theme, number one, asks, can you notice where you still return to the beginning instead of living from what is already stabilized? Can you feel the difference between awareness and self monitoring? Can you allow coherence to remain without repeatedly checking whether it is still there? Can you trust light format enough to let it function as a governing state? Can you stop repairing what is not actually broken? Can you let continuity become more natural than vigilance? So those are the questions, some of the questions to ask for this theme. And now we're going to move into theme number 2, legibility without tone adjustment. The external field reads what you no longer translate. And the subline for this is remaining in your actual soul tone while life begins responding to what is truly there. The harmonic function arc is non adaptive signal readability. Individual field releases habit of softening, reshaping, or translating soul tone in order to create comfort, approval, predictability, or easy reception. External field begins reading your signal with greater fidelity because it no longer is meeting as much adaptive modification. So, with that, then, this theme, legibility without tone adjustment, means your field is learning to remain in its true soul tone without converting the tone into a survival based presentation. For many people, tone adjustment has been automatic strategy. It is operated quietly in the background as a way to stay safe, stay liked, stay understandable, or stay connected. This can look like softening your clarity before you speak, reducing the strength of what you know, emotionally cushioning your presence, making yourself easier to receive, or unconsciously shifting your energetic expression to match the comfort level of others. Anybody done that? Humaning. It's such a grand adventure. So, in this theme, number 2, the guides are showing that these forms of modulation may have once helped maintain relational safety, but they also made your true signal, your soul signal, less legible. That they created interference between your soul tone and the field's ability to read it clearly. It was muffled, my friends. Your soul signal, your soul tone may have been muffled. So April begins changing that. Instead of preparing yourself to be received by adjusting your tone first, you begin allowing your soul signal to stand in its own structure. You don't have to sharpen it. You don't have to defend it. You don't have to force it outward. You simply stopped interrupting it. That is the shift. Your soul tone becomes more available because you are no longer automatically translating it into something shaped by non beneficial survival patterning. That is why this theme is called legibility without tone adjustment. The emphasis is not just on authenticity in a broad emotional sense. The emphasis is on whether your original signal can remain intact enough to be read. The more your field stays in its true tone, your soul tone, the more the external field has the opportunity to register what is genuinely there. That registration may still vary according to capacity. Not everyone will read it with the same clarity, but there is now less distortion being introduced by your own adaptation. And this creates a major structural shift in how life responds to you. Reality can begin responding to your genuine structure rather than to a modified, pre softened, or survival adjusted version of your signal. Some interactions may become clearer and cleaner. Some relationships may reveal where they depended on your self modulation in order to function. And I know that can be sometimes really hard, and that can be a lot of, loss and grief with that too. So be kind to the human and a lot of compassion to yourself and others as you're moving through this. Some opportunities may begin arriving with greater precision because the field is meeting a truer signal. This is not about performance. It is about removal of interference. It is about allowing your soul tone to remain legible enough that response can begin organizing around what is actually true. So, why this matters now? This theme matters in April because recognition alone is not the full shift. March began the process of the field registering your stabilized tone with greater accuracy. April begins moving that recognition towards response. But for response to become more coherent, your signal must be less interrupted by adaptation or by that non beneficial survival signal. And that's why this theme sits where it does in this month. If your field is still translating itself before contact, then reality is still responding to a version of you that has already been modified by survival based patterning. And that's essentially the non beneficial survival based patterning that we're talking about. So the field may be meeting you, but it may not fully meet your original structure. So April begins exposing that difference more so clearly. It shows you where tone adjustment has remained active even after greater internal stabilization has already been established. Learning to catch yourself in terms of tone adjustment is such an important part of this. Self-realization is such an important part of this because wait, I caught myself. I didn't even realize I was doing that. And now I caught myself. And then with that awareness, you can start then releasing any kind of habits that are no longer beneficial to you. So with that then, um, it's important. This is important. Okay. So if your field, let's just take this again. So if your field is still translating itself before contact, then the reality is still responding to a version of you that's already been modified, like I said, by non beneficial survival based patterning. And the field may be meeting you, but it's not fully meeting your original structure. So it's really important to take time to understand this. And then April gives you the opportunity to start utilizing discernment and start to really catch yourself because it shows you where the tone adjustment has remained active even after greater internal stabilization has already been established. And I know I said that twice, but it's really important because when you start to learn to catch yourself, and I have this moment where I kind of do this, like I start to, on the podcast, you won't be able to see me doing this, but I have this thing where I catch myself and I know like, oh, I'm catching myself doing something. And in that moment, there is like a crossroads moment where you can go into the habit that's been complete or the non beneficial habit, or you can start to create a new way of being. And you want to start putting that into practice, the new way of being in terms of the habit. So then you're letting go of the old and you're shifting into the new. But part of it is catching yourself, doing things. You are part of this. This is part of the humaning. This is part of the multidimensional process. And this is part of the human responsibility and accountability to the human is to start clearing, non-beneficial imprints, even non-beneficial imprints of habits and shifting into new ways of being. All right. So this is all important because many forms of self-modulation are so familiar, they no longer feel like adjustment. They can be so in the subconscious. They can feel so normal. They can feel relational. Other people might be doing it. So then it's like this collective thing that it feels relational. They can also feel polite. They feel responsible. But in this part of the work, the guides are showing the constant tone modulation become a form of structural interference. It interrupts direct legibility. It reduces the accuracy of contact. It keeps the external field from fully organizing around what is actually present and from actually connecting to your true soul signal, your soul tone. So then April helps unwind that pattern. It teaches the field that coherent reception becomes more possible when your soul tone is allowed to remain intact. So, with that, then, how this might feel. So, at the human level, this theme can feel very practical. You may notice yourself catching the impulse to soften your language before you speak. You may realize how often you've tried to sound, less direct, less certain, less clear, or less strong in order to make others more comfortable. You may become more aware of how quickly you scan. I just want to say something. There's a podcast that I wrote 2 days ago, and I've been so on the fence about releasing it. And this is exactly what it's talking to, because I don't want to make other people uncomfortable. I don't want to, and it's just speaking my light truth. It's speaking to something that I saw, and in this world, I'm hoping that we can bring more awareness so that way we can really grow and learn and support one another in more of a beneficial way. And um so there you go. It kind of answers my question about whether or not I because I've been on the fence, and yesterday I was like, "Oh, I'm just going to keep it as like a something that I just wrote in my journal." And now I realize, as I'm talking about this theme, that this is a way. You have to notice catching the impulse to soften your language before you speak. And so that is something that I have done and apparently am still doing in some ways. And so this is part of the realization. So even I'm this podcast episode is lighting coded. And so it's realizing, wow, this is exactly what this theme is speaking to. Whew. So you may notice yourself catching the impulse, as I just did, to soften your language before you speak. And I'm obviously talking about that other episode. You may notice how often you try to sound, less direct, less certain, or less strong in order to make others more comfortable. And that makes me feel so sad right now. I am having a moment of just, uh, whew. So you may become aware of how quickly you scan a room, a conversation, or relationship, and then subtly adjust your energetic tone to fit what seems most acceptable. You may notice where you've confused self-modulation. Who y'all, I am having some tears are just flowing. I'm having some sadness. Hold on, let me just take some breaths and do some Reiki. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, and this is part of it. This is the real, y'all, where you can't just speak to things and just put it out there and not be in the process of a relationship with it. And this is the part of self realization where you are here to learn, grow, and evolve. And even if you're sharing things, you are part of it. We are in this human experience. Okay. So you may become aware of how quickly you scan a room, conversation, or relationship and then subtly adjust your energetic tone to fit what seems most acceptable. You may notice where you have confused self modulation with kindness or dilution with connection. So, as April progresses, you may begin feeling less willing to perform those adjustments automatically. Not from resistance, not from withdrawal, but because your system is starting to recognize how much energy has been spent maintaining legibility through adaptation rather than through actual light truth. And this can create a mixed experience at first. Some moments may feel cleaner, more relieving because you no longer have to work so hard to manage reception. Other moments may feel exposed because your usual strategy of modulation is no longer leading. The body may need time to learn that staying in your true soul tone does not automatically create rupture. And that's part of the recalibration. So, this theme may also show up through clearer discernment. You may start noticing which people, spaces, and systems can meet your genuine soul tone and which ones depended on your adjustment in order to feel comfortable. And by adjustment, your non beneficial survival signal or part of that is then you modulating yourself to make others comfortable. That clarity is useful. It's part of how the field becomes more accurate, and you just literally witnessed me going through it, where I just had all of this moment. And then I'm using the tools, I'm using Reiki, I'm labeling. There's sadness, there's grief. I'm taking a moment. And when I took a moment, I also called in more support from my soul, my oversoul, my collective guidance light team as I was doing Reiki and breath work, supporting the human, recognizing I'm multidimensional and not bypassing, the experience because I'm literally talking about this. It's light encoded. It's meant to support. Okay, so energetically speaking, non-adaptive signal readability. So energetically, this theme is about reducing the layers of adaptive interference between your soul signal and the external field. So when survival-based modulation is active, your signal is not absent, but it is filtered. The field does not fully meet your original tone, your soul tone. It meets a translated presentation. That presentation may still carry some light truth, but it carries light truth through adjustment. And then over time, this can create distortion in relationships, opportunities, energetic exchange, because response is forming around a version of you that required pre contact modification. And so then April begins loosening that. As your field stops translating itself as much, your soul tone becomes easier to read in its original structure. This increases signal fidelity. It increases legibility. It allows the outer field, the external field, to register your presence with less confusion created by self interruption. You may notice energetic signs of this, such as less internal compression before speaking, less emotional cushioning in order to maintain connection, clearer distinction between true resonance and accommodation, faster recognition of where your tone is met and where it is resisted, less energetic labor spent trying to make yourself more receivable, more accurate feedback from external field because less adaptation is shaping the interaction first. This doesn't mean every response becomes easy. It just means the responses become more revealing. They carry more information about what is actually being met. And so with that, I will say, just the thought of um, you know, like less energetic labor spent trying to make yourself more receivable, like that's amazing. Yes to that. Please, thank you. And then here's a message from Oversoul Stream of Sahariel. What you're releasing here is not care. It's not sensitivity. It's not relational intelligence. You're releasing the reflex that assumes your original tone must be adjusted in order to remain connected. That reflex was built inside environments where readability was negotiated through adaptation. But your field is entering a different phase now. Your soul tone does not need to become more acceptable in order to become more legible. It needs to remain more intact. When your signal stays in its own structure, the field can begin responding to what is truly there. This changes the quality of contact. It changes the quality of opportunity. It changes the quality of recognition. What is meeting you can only organize accurately around what is actually present. So the work here is not to force visibility, it is to reduce self interruption. As that happens, life can begin responding with greater precision to the tone that is already stabilized within you. And that's the end of the message. What's interesting for this one, as we've been moving through it, what's come up too is the realization of the human has free will. The human has free will. And so, even though you may be saying yes to, connecting to your soul, you may be strong, you have free will. So, you might be saying stronger to being in non beneficial survival signal. And so that is why your human is actively a part of this. It is, it is in this, I look at it as like a trifecta of, your human with your soul, your oversoul, and then you have your collective guidance light team. But it's really the your soul, your oversoul, and your human. You're in this relationship, and then your collective guidance light team is helping in relationship to, working with your oversoul soul and the human. So the more that you can understand how the energy works and how free will works, and then utilizing, we've been utilizing harmonic phrases, to support in terms of the clearing and the shifting as well, which they can be similar to like affirmations, but they're much more declarative statements, and they're often like coded in terms of like coded. So the more that you just keep using the tools, and a big one is the self-realization and understanding how free will can be working, and it might be working in a subconscious way where you're not even realizing what you're actually choosing in the moment, which is why it's important to catch yourself and becoming aware and awake to it. What is the reality that's being created? And you become awake to it. And then you use the tools to help the human. If there's sadness that comes up, if there's, anything else, dysregulation, resetting the nervous system, etc. Okay, so for this theme that we are in, currently we are talking about theme 2, legibility without tone adjustment. The external field reads what you no longer translate. Let us do an example then. Okay, so here's the example. You're in a conversation where you normally would soften what you know in order to keep the exchange comfortable. In the past, you may have added extra explanation, changed your tone, smiled when it was not true, reduced the strength of your clarity, or tried to make your presence easier to take in. But this time, you might notice the reflex and you don't follow it. You stay calm, you stay clear, you stay in your actual soul tone. You don't harden, you don't overstate, you don't retreat, you simply stop adjusting. And because of that, something different becomes possible. The moment organizes around what is actually there. The other person may meet you more cleanly, they may pause, they may reveal discomfort, they may respond with more respect, they may expose where they only knew how to relate to a softened version of you. They may share that. But whatever happens, the exchange becomes more accurate. And the accuracy is part of the gift of this theme. So then what this theme builds in April. This theme builds one key structural mechanics of April. Response becomes more coherent when signal becomes less adaptive. April is not just about being seen. It is about the beginning of outer field reorganization around what has stabilized within you. But the outer field can only respond. And when we're talking about the outer field, we're talking about the external field. The external field can only respond directly to what is genuinely available. Theme 2 helps make that availability possible. It strengthens the bridge between inner coherence and outward life. It reduces the energetic gap between what you are in what others are meeting. It reveals where adaptation has been maintaining distorted forms of connection. It allows resonance, mismatch, opportunity, and response to become clearer. So, in this way, theme 2 supports the larger April movement of alignment after recognition. March made your signal more readable. And by signal, we're talking about your soul signal. April begins teaching your field not to interrupt that readability through modulation. So then questions this theme asks. Can you recognize the difference between true relational care and survival-based tone adjustment? Can you notice when you begin translating your soul tone before anyone else has fully met you? Can you remain clear without turning clarity into hardness? Can you let your signal, your soul signal, stay intact long enough for the field to respond to what is actually there? Can you allow life to show you which connections require your modulation and which ones can meet your light truth? Can you trust that greater legibility does not come from performance? Can you trust that greater legibility does not come from performance, but by reducing interference? So that moves us then into theme 3. Staying in your own field during contact. Coherence holds while internal field engages. The subline of this one is remaining self-held while contact happens without leaving your structure. The harmonic function is contact without departure. So the individual field is learning to remain self-held in contact without leaving its own structure to manage, anticipate, or compensate for what is happening around it. The external field begins engaging with less ability to pull you out of your coherence through pressure, projection, or emotional demand. So, this theme then, staying in your own field during contact, means your system is learning how to remain inside its own stabilized structure while contact with the external field is actually happening. So, this theme is about coherence during interaction. It is about no longer leaving your field in order to track, manage, anticipate, absorb, or compensate for what another person's situation or environment is doing. For many people, contact has not only meant connection, it has also meant departure from self. The moment another person brings emotion, need, pressure, expectation, projection, or intensity, the field, your internal field, your personal field, may have learned to move outward in response, especially if you are somebody who's highly sensitive, somebody who is really an intuitive empath. You may have learned to move outward in response. And so it then may begin monitoring the room, adjusting to another person's state, preparing for friction, softening itself, or attempting to stabilize the interaction by leaving its own center. So, in this theme, the guides are showing that contact does not require self departure. Again, if you're somebody who's highly sensitive, or if you're an intuitive empath, whatever language resonates, this is something that if you've been doing this, it is such an important theme to understand and realize that it does not mean you have to contact does not require self departure. So coherence can remain intact while engagement occurs. And when I actually went through my first Reiki training class, I will say this is something that was brought in, and I realized, oh, I had been doing this, and Reiki really helped supporting me having healthier boundaries with myself and others in the world. And it was because, me being such a highly sensitive person, an intuitive empath, and just, the early ways that, I learned to walk through the world. So this is a really important theme and messaging, for everyone, but especially if you're a highly sensitive person. So Coherence can remain intact while engagement occurs. As April progresses, the distinction between the individual field and the external field becomes stronger. You begin learning you can stay in your own structure while life meets you. This is what creates a more accurate basis for alignment. The external field can begin responding to your actual stabilized tone because you're no longer leaving it in order to manage contact. April begins strengthening that capacity. So instead of abandoning your own structure, the moment engagement begins, you start remaining more fully inside it. You don't have to brace in order to stay present. You don't have to merge in order to stay connected. You don't have to anticipate every movement around you in order to remain safe. You begin holding your own field while contact occurs. That is the shift. Coherence is no longer something you can only feel when alone, undisturbed, or inwardly protected. It becomes something that can remain present while interaction is happening. Your field learns that staying in contact does not require leaving your own structure. That is why the theme is called Staying in Your Own Field During Contact. The emphasis is not merely on boundaries in a general sense. The emphasis is on whether your original coherence can remain intact while the external field is active. The more your system stays the more your system stays self-held during contact, the less the external field can organize the interaction through your adaptive departure. This creates a major structural shift in how engagement works. Life begins meeting a field that stays in place rather than one that immediately moves outward to manage what is happening. This is not withdrawal. It's not disconnection. It's not detachment. It is the strengthening of internal residency during contact so the interaction can occur without the loss of self structure. So, my friend, this one is a huge, huge one to understand. Like, huge. Okay, so why this theme matters now. This theme matters in April because alignment does not deepen only through clearer signal. It also deepens through your ability to remain in your own structure while the outer field is actively engaging you. March supported the beginnings of recognition. April begins the next movement. What happens when the field not only reads you, but starts interacting with you more directly? What happens when life begins responding? People begin engaging, conversations begin opening, or relational dynamics begin becoming more active. So, if your coherence disappears the moment contact happens, then stabilization has not yet become functional in relationship. It may be present inwardly, but it is not yet fully held in interaction. And that's why theme 3 becomes important. The guides are showing that many people have learned to leave their own field the moment contact becomes active. This can happen so quickly that it's almost invisible. The system starts tracking the other person's tone. It begins adjusting to pressure. It anticipates emotional demand. It senses projection. It starts compensating before anything has even fully landed. This pattern may have once served safety, belonging, or relational survival, but it has also taught the field that contact requires self displacement. And April begins undoing that. This theme helps establish a different relationship to engagement. Contact can happen without your coherence collapsing into management. Interaction can occur without you leaving your own signal. That shift is essential because the external field cannot respond accurately to your stabilized tone if you exit it as soon as something begins happening around you. So, how this might feel in terms of the human. At the human level, this theme can feel both subtle and significant. You may begin noticing how quickly you leave yourself in a conversation. You may catch the moment when someone's energy changes and your body immediately starts adjusting. You may realize how often you prepare for another person's reaction before they have even fully expressed it. You may see where you move into emotional management, over awareness, explanation, soothing, or internal compensation the moment a relational field becomes active. As April progresses, you may start feeling less willing to do that automatically. This does not mean you stop caring. It means your system begins distinguishing between caring and leaving your own field. It means you begin recognizing that presence does not require over participation in what is happening around you. You may remain more grounded while someone else is emotional. You may stay clearer while someone else is projecting. You may notice that you can hear, witness, engage without absorbing, merging, or departing from your own structure in order to stabilize the exchange. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. It might feel uncomfortable. Growing can sometimes be like that. And it can also you might have emotions. There may be some loss and grief, some sadness. So you want to use your tools to support yourself and help your human. Some people may interpret your coherence differently because they're accustomed to engaging with your adaptation rather than your self-held presence. They may be used to you being at their beck and call, and they may not like the change. They may be used to you giving 98% and them barely showing up with 2%, and they may not be used to it. And so you have to just keep using support for yourself, mindfulness tools, compassion, and, healthy boundaries. Your own nervous system may also need to learn that staying in your field during contact is safe. And that is a big part of the work here. The body is learning that engagement does not require internal relocation. If you're in the Meditate with Me classes in the Inspiring You Patreon, we have been doing a ton of nervous system tools since, we've been doing for a long time, but really diligently since last year. In fact, it's like every month we have something in regard to the nervous system that we're working with. So, energetically speaking, contact without departure. Energetically, this theme strengthens the distinction between the individual field and the external field. When this distinction is weak, contact often creates blending, overreading, compensation, or internal movement away from one's own center. The field senses what is happening externally and then reorganizes itself around the input. Over time, this can create a habit of leaving one's own coherence the moment pressure or interaction begins. And April begins changing that pattern. So in theme 3, the field starts learning how to remain structurally located within itself even while contact is occurring. This is major harmonic development. It means coherence becomes more portable. It does not vanish when the environment becomes active. It does not require isolation in order to remain true. It can stay present inside conversation, exchange, relationship, and contact. So you may notice energetic signs of this, such as less immediate outward scanning during interaction, less tendency to merge with another person's emotional state, less internal compulsion to fix, soothe, or stabilize the entire exchange, greater ability to feel your own center while someone else is activated, more clarity about what belongs to your field and what belongs to theirs, less pressure to leave your tone in order to maintain connection, more stable coherence during relational movement. This does not mean the external field stops trying to pull on you. It means it begins having less ability to reorganize you through pressure, projection, or emotional demand. Here's a message from Oversoul Stream of Sahariel. You're learning that contact is not the same as departure. For a long time, the field may have treated engagement as a cue to move outward. It learned to track first, anticipate first, manage first, and stabilize the environment before remaining in itself. But this weakened the continuity of your own coherence during relationship. The pattern was not only about sensitivity, it was about survival based contact behavior. It assumed that staying connected required leaving your own field. That assumption is now being revised. You do not need to exit your structure in order to remain present. You do not need to merge in order to understand. You do not need to compensate in order to care. Your coherence is becoming strong enough to remain where it is while contact unfolds around it. This changes the quality of exchange. It changes the quality of discernment. It changes the quality of alignment. When you stay in your own field during contact, the external field has less access to your adaptation and more access to your true light structure. This is one of the ways reality begins responding to what is real rather than what is strategically adjusted for survival. That's the end of the message. Okay, so here's an example. You are in a conversation with someone who is emotional, intense, or projecting expectation. In the past, your field may have immediately moved toward them. You may have started adjusting your tone, tracking their mood, trying to keep the interaction smooth, or internally reorganizing yourself around what they seem to need. But this time, something different happens. You remain present, but you also remain located. You can feel your own body. You can feel your own tone. You can hear what they're expressing without moving out of your own structure in order to manage it. You don't shut down. You don't become cold. You don't disappear into strategy. You stay connected without departing from yourself. And because of that, the interaction becomes more accurate. The other person is meeting more of your real field, not only your adaptive responsiveness. Their their pressure has less power to define the energetic shape of the exchange. Your coherence becomes part of the contact rather than something you lose during it. And this is part of the gift of this theme. Okay, so what this theme builds in April, the theme builds another core mechanic of April. Alignment requires coherence that can remain intact during engagement. Theme two focused on signal legibility without tone adjustment. Theme three deepens that by addressing what happens once contact actually begins. It teaches your field how to remain in place while interaction unfolds. And this is essential for April because the month is not only about being more accurately read, it's about beginning to live inside clearer forms of response, relationship, and exchange. Theme three supports that by helping the field distinguish self from external input more clearly, reduce adaptive compensation during engagement, remain self held while contact is active, allow relational experience to organize around light truth rather than survival based management, strengthen the continuity of coherence across interaction, not just in solitude. And this is how the individual field and the external field begin coming into more accurate relationship. Contact still happens, engagement still happens, but it no longer requires you to leave your own structure in order to participate. So the questions this theme asks are: can you recognize the moment contact causes you to leave your own field? Can you feel the difference between presence and compensation? Can you remain caring without becoming structurally displaced? Can you stay in your own coherence while the external field is active? Can you allow another person's emotions, projections, or expectations to remain theirs without abandoning your own center? Can you trust that alignment deepens when contact happens without self departure? So, those are the questions for theme three. And now we're going to go to theme four. Theme four is the first accurate movements of response. The external field begins orienting to what it has recognized. Subline initial correspondence begins as the outer field starts adjusting to what is actually there. The harmonic function is initial correspondence. The individual field holds tone with greater continuity, less fluctuation, and that's soul tone, allowing response to emerge without chasing it. The external field begins making its first subtle but real movements of alignment around what now accurately recognizes. So, with that, then, hold on one second. I'm just going to take a sip of water. All right, let's talk about this theme. So, this theme, then, the first accurate movements of response. So, what does this mean, my friends? The first accurate movements of response means the external field is beginning to make its earliest real adjustments around the signal it has now more accurately recognized. So the theme is about the beginning of correspondence. It is the point where recognition starts becoming response, not full reorganization, not instant change, not a total external shift all at once, but the first actual movements of orientation begins appearing in the outer field, the external field, because something stable is now being read with greater fidelity. For many people, there has been a long history of trying to generate response through effort, over signaling, repetition, self explanation, emotional labor, or strategic adjustment. But this theme is showing something different. Response begins to emerge not because you're forcing it, but because your tone is holding with enough continuity that the external field, the outer field, can start organizing around it. Timing may begin shifting, communication may begin landing differently, relational exchanges may start showing more coherence. The environment may begin offering small but real signs that it's orienting to what it now recognizes. And this is the first layer of accurate outer field correspondence. April begins opening that movement. So instead of trying to create alignment by chasing it, managing it, or pulling response toward you, you begin holding your tone with greater continuity, your soul tone. You stop interrupting the process through over effort or fluctuation. You stop assuming that response only counts if it's dramatic or immediate. You allow the field to begin answering what it has already stabilized. That is the shift. The individual field becomes more consistent in its own signal. And because of that, the external field begins making subtle but real movements toward greater alignment. These movements may be small, but they matter. They show that what has been recognized is now beginning to be responded to. And that is why the theme is called the first accurate movements of response. The emphasis is not on getting everything to change at once. The emphasis is on the fact that response is beginning to occur in a way that reflects greater accuracy. And with that, then, it's also beneficial to note when that is happening and you noticing it. So, for instance, if you're in the dowsing all access part and you do one of the abundance dowsing sessions from that course I mentioned, from the crystalline abundance course I mentioned, then you go out and something happens where you have an opportunity where, say, you forgot to put money in the meter and you come back and you didn't get a ticket, and you notice maybe someone else did. That is, or maybe somebody else had talked about getting a ticket, previously, because maybe they were more so out on the streets that week and you didn't get a ticket. That's abundance. That's you did the work, and the external field is responding. So, and I share that because somebody they did the abundance course, and that actually did happen. And it was like, one of those like miracle moments because they were gone for quite a few hours. And it's a way to notice like, wow, something actually shifted and to note. So, but it's also important to understand then the outer world, the external field is not fully reorganized yet, but it is no longer entirely static in relationship. It's no longer static in relation to your stabilized tone. It begins moving in small coherent ways around what it is now accurately registered. It creates a structural shift in how alignment is understood. Alignment is no longer only internal. It begins showing its first signs externally through timing, tone, pacing, communication, and environmental response. So, why this matters now? This theme matters in April because April is the month where recognition begins moving toward response. March established the first layer of being read more accurately, and the field began registering your stabilized tone with greater fidelity. That was crucial threshold because nothing in the outer field can reorganize. Nothing in the external field can reorganize around what it has not actually recognized. If your soul signal is not being recognized, how is the external field going to recognize it? But recognition alone is not the whole movement. Once something has been registered more accurately, the next question becomes, does the field begin responding to it? And theme 4 says yes, but carefully. The guides are showing that April begins the first phase of correspondence. So, this is not yet the full visible reordering of reality. It is the stage where small but meaningful movements start appearing. That may mean a conversation opens more naturally. A delay lifts. Timing begins to flow with less friction. A person responds differently. An environment becomes less contradictory. A decision becomes easier to make. A communication carries more coherence. These may seem like modest changes on the surface, but they are significant because they reflect a real shift. The external field is starting to orient to what it has recognized. This matters because many people miss early response when they're expecting large scale proof. I'm going to repeat that. This matters because many people miss early response when they're expecting, woo, yeah, large scale proof. Y'all, you got to start seeing these signs that, oh wow, things are shifting. So they overlook subtle but accurate movements because they are trained to look for dramatic change. But this theme teaches a different kind of discernment. It asks you to notice first correspondence, the earliest accurate signs, the small adjustments that reveal the outer world is no longer responding in exactly the same way it did before. And so, with that, we come then to how this might feel in regard to the human. So, at the human level, this theme may feel like the beginning of small but undeniable changes. You may notice that something starts moving that had felt stalled. You may see communication becoming clearer without needing as much effort from you. You may feel less friction in timing. You may find that the right people respond a little more directly, a little more clearly, or a little more quickly. You may notice that environments which once felt confusing begin offering cleaner feedback. You may feel that certain interactions no longer require the same amount of labor to get to a point of understanding or movement. And this theme can also feel quiet at first. The response may not arrive in a form that looks dramatic. It may come through subtle changes in pacing, tone, receptivity, sequencing, or atmosphere. A conversation that usually misfires may land more cleanly. A person who previously, a person who was previously inconsistent may begin responding in a steadier way. A timing issue may begin resolving without force. Something in the environment may feel less resistant and more willing to be met to meet what is actually there. So the first movements matter because they show that response is beginning to organize around light truth rather than around distortion, delay, or adaptive overcompensation. So, energetically speaking, initial correspondence. Energetically, this theme marks the first stage where external field begins reflecting back some degree of alignment to the stabilized tone it has now recognized. In the earlier phases, your work may have been focused on stabilization, self holding, signal clarity, reducing adaptive interference. All of that was necessary because the external field, the outer field, cannot correspond accurately to a signal that is unstable, overmodified, or inconsistent in its own continuity. But once your tone holds with greater steadiness, and this is your soul tone holds with greater steadiness, the field has more opportunity to orient around it or to respond to it. That is what theme 4 begins showing. The individual field does not need to chase response. It does not need to keep testing the environment to see whether alignment is happening. It holds tone with greater continuity. This allows correspondence to begin emerging more naturally. The external field, the outer field, then starts making its earliest subtle adjustments in timing, communication, access, relational tone, or environmental behavior. So, with this, then you may notice energetic signs of this, such as less need to push for movement, more natural opening in communication, subtle decrease in contradictory signals. And that's like mixed signals from your, we're talking about soul signal versus non beneficial signal. Cleaner pacing in interactions and decisions, less energetic drag around things that are becoming aligned, small but genuine signs that the environment is orienting differently, is responding differently. A growing sense that response is beginning to come from the field rather than from your management of it, which means you might feel less tired because there might be less labor involved. This does not mean every part of your life changes immediately. It means the first layer of accurate response is starting to appear. So here's the message from Oversoul Stream of Sahara. You're learning to recognize the difference between forcing response and allowing correspondence. For a long time, the field may have been trained to seek movement through amplification, explanation, repetition, emotional labor, or strategic effort. That pattern developed because response often seemed unavailable unless it was pursued. But April begins teaching a different rhythm. When tone holds with greater continuity, response does not need to be chased in the same way. The external field can begin orienting, responding through recognition. This is the beginning of that movement. Do not overlook what is subtle. Hold on one second. Okay. Here's the rest of the message. Do not overlook what is subtle. The first accurate movements of response are often quiet, but they're structurally important. They show what is stabilized within you is beginning to create real correspondence outside you. The field is learning how to answer what is now more clearly present. Timing begins adjusting. Pathways begin opening. Communication begins finding a truer pacing. Relational tone begins shifting where capacity exists. These are not random changes. They are the first signs that alignment is becoming interactive. Let the small movements teach you. They are part of the architecture of trust. And that's the end of that message. I'm just going to take a little bit more water. Okay, so here's an example of this theme. And just a reminder, we are on theme number 4, first accurate movements of response. The external field begins orienting to what it has recognized. Okay, so this example. You've been holding a situation with steadiness, but without clear movement from the outside. In the past, you tried to push the process, explain more, repeat yourself, overmanage timing, or search constantly for signs that something was changing. But now something different happens. You stay in your own tone, you stop chasing, you stop forcing interpretation. You stop pulling as the field for proof. And then a small but real shift occurs. Someone responds with more clarity. Timing opens where it's been stalled. A conversation lands more accurately. A previously inconsistent exchange becomes more direct. An opportunity presents itself with less distortion around it. It may look dramatic, but it's real. The outer field has begun making its first movements of response around what is now more accurately recognized. This is not yet the full reorganization, but it is the beginning of correspondence. And that is part of the gift of this theme. So, what this theme builds in April, this theme builds one of the key structural turning points of April. The month begins moving from recognition into response. Theme 1 and Theme 2 addressed readability, legibility. Theme 3 addressed staying in your own field during contact. Theme 4 builds from all of that by showing what begins to happen when your outer field has enough accurate information to start moving differently. This theme helps establish that internal stabilization can begin generating external correspondence. Coherence does not only change interstate, it begins affecting timing and response. The external field starts making real small adjustments around what it now reads more accurately. Alignment can first appear through subtle but light truthful movements rather than dramatic change. The individual field does not need to chase response when soul tone is hold with continuity. This is essential for April because the month of April is not only about clearer perception, it is about beginning of actual relational and environmental adjustment. And theme 4 reveals the first layer of that process. Okay, so here's questions for this theme. Can you recognize the difference between forcing movement and allowing response to emerge? Can you notice the first subtle signs that the outer field is orienting differently? Can you trust small, accurate movements instead of dismissing them because they're not dramatic? Can you hold your tone and can you hold your soul tone with enough continuity? That response does not need to be chased. Can you let the first coherent changes teach you that alignment is beginning to take form externally? Can you remain steady while correspondence begins in its earliest stages? Okay, so then we're going to move to theme 5. Theme 5 is nervous system safety in being met. The body learns that response does not require performance. The subline is somatic trust begins forming as the body receives context support and response without converting them into pressure. Harmonic function arc is somatic tolerance for alignment. Individual feel begins allowing support, contact, and response without automatically turning them into signals of danger, pressure, or required performance. External field may begin offering more coherent response, giving the body new evidence that being met does not always require defense, overfunctioning, or self editing. Okay, so theme 5. Nervous system safety in being met means the body is beginning to learn that contact, support, response, and recognition do not automatically require defense, performance, or anticipatory protection. This theme is somatic. It addresses what happens in the body when alignment begins appearing more clearly in the external field. Even when life starts responding with greater coherence, the nervous system may still interpret being seen, being supported, being contacted, or being responded to as the beginning of pressure. For many people, being met has not always historically felt simple. It has often carried cost. It may have meant being misread, being expected to perform, being asked for more than what was truly available, or being drawn into overfunctioning, self-editing, or relational vigilance. Because of that, the body may have learned to associate response with demand. In this theme, the guides are showing that April is not only changing the quality of external response, it's also helping the body develop greater tolerance for receiving that response without turning it into danger. The response, so with that, then, the nervous system begins learning that being met does not always require bracing, managing, compensating, or preparing for impact. And that is the shift. Alignment becomes more somatically receivable. April begins supporting that learning. Instead of automatically tightening when support appears or becoming alert when contact becomes clearer, the body begins having new experiences of being met without immediate cost. You do not have to earn every response. You do not have to prepare for pressure every time attention, help, or coherence arrives. You do not have to convert support into obligation. I'm going to say that one again. You do not have to convert support into obligation, my friends. Your system begins noticing that some forms of contact can be received without self editing, and some forms of response can be allowed without overfunctioning. That is what starts changing here. The body becomes more willing to stay present when alignment arrives instead of immediately translating it into threat, demand, or performance. And that is why this theme is called nervous system safety in being met. The emphasis is not only on the fact that response is happening, the emphasis is on whether the body can actually receive it. It is so important because if your body can't receive it, how are you going to receive the gifts the universe is trying to give you? You're hot potatoing it away then. So the emphasis is on whether the body can actually receive it. The more the nervous system learns that coherent response does not automatically lead to pressure, the more alignment can move from being conceptually understood to physically tolerated. This creates a major structural shift in how support, visibility, and contact are lived. Being met no longer has to activate the same defensive patterns that once formed around misreading, over-responsibility, or relational cost. Okay, so why this matters now. This theme matters in April because the external field, the outer field alignment is only part of the process. If the body cannot safely receive clear response, then even coherent support can still feel destabilizing. March focused on recognition. Early April begins response. But once response starts appearing, another layer becomes visible. How does the body interpret it? Does it recognize support as support? Or does it immediately read contact as pressure, response as expectation, coherence as the beginning of demand? And this is why nervous system tools are so important. And that's why we've been talking about it. It's come up in the last couple of years. It's all part of it. And that's why in the Meditate with Me classes, we are often doing part of the work is nervous system tools. Because if your nervous system does not recognize, interpret support as support, and it is reading it as danger, you literally may be saying no to actually beneficial support. So then the guides are showing that many people have developed nervous system patterns around being met. These patterns are not random. They are formed through repeated experiences where contact carried burden, visibility carried misreading, support came with strings, or attention quickly became obligation. Does that resonate with anybody else? And just imagine your body, you're a physical body. And so that could have imprinted again and again and again and created habits and so many other aspects. And so then the body adapted by becoming vigilant. The nervous system was trained. So part of it is untraining the nervous system and retraining the nervous system in regard to your light and receiving, et cetera, et cetera. And the Meditate with Me classes, we do that work. So the body adapted by becoming vigilant. It learned to prepare, edit, brace, overgive, or perform as soon as something started arriving from the external field, from the outside. April begins softening that reflex. And as the external field starts offering more coherent response, the nervous system is given new evidence. And so it begins seeing that being met does not always require collapse into performance. It does not always require self-correction. It does not always mean that more will be demanded from you than is aligned. It doesn't mean that you have to overgive. And this matters because true alignment is not only about this matters because true alignment is not only about life responding more clearly. It is also about your body being able to remain present enough to receive that response without activating old protective strategies. I put out a podcast about overgiving and under receiving. And so if this theme is like resonating with you, I definitely would recommend going to listen to that podcast episode. Okay, so in terms of this theme, how the human level, how this might feel in the human. At the human level, this theme may feel surprisingly tender. So be kind to the human. You may notice that when someone responds clearly, part of you still braces. You may feel that when support appears, your body still wants to repay it immediately, explain itself, or become more useful. You may see it when attention comes toward you, your system starts preparing to perform, manage, or overdeliver. You may notice how quickly coherent contacts can still trigger an old readiness posture in the body. So, in that readiness posture, we were talking about like non beneficial readiness. So this theme helps make those reactions visible without treating them as failure. They were beneficial at some point. We're all here to learn, grow, and evolve. They were beneficial at some point. Now they're being called for completion. So compassion and kindness for the human. As April progresses, you may begin having moments where a clear response comes in and your body does not escalate in the same way. That is something to note. And for me, I'm like, okay, good job, human. All right, human. So, however it is for you, though. In April, as April progresses, you may also begin to notice like conversations may feel easier to receive. Support may feel less loaded. Being understood may create less internal pressure. You may begin noticing that you can stay softer in the body while still being seen. You may feel less urgency to explain, less compulsion to overfunction, less need to convert every form of contact into a job you have to do well. This does not necessarily happen all at once. The body often learns through repetition, but April can begin introducing those repetitions. It can begin offering small but meaningful moments in which your system realizes I am being met and I do not need to become someone else in order to survive this. Energetically speaking, this is about somatic tolerance for alignment. Energetically, this theme is about increasing the body's capacity to remain regulated while clear alignment begins appearing in the external field. When somatic tolerance is low, even beneficial response can feel activating. The field may have wanted recognition, support, clarity, or cleaner contact, but when those things arrive, the body still reacts through old survival logic. It interprets being met as exposure. It interprets support as debt. It interprets response as demand. It interprets clarity as the beginning of a test. That is the pattern April begins changing. And if you're in the all access and the Inspiring You Patreon, that 3-part crystalline abundance dowsing course, we talk a lot about this in regard to the old survival and also in the non-beneficial clearing, non-beneficial survival, shifting into thriving. That dowsing course, we also talk about this. I think it's so important to understand how non-beneficial survival patterns and programs can possibly be affecting your human. All right. So this pattern, though, is beginning to change in April. As the external field starts offering more coherence, the nervous system begins receiving updated information. It starts learning that contact doesn't always lead to engulfment, response does not always require performance, support does not always demand self abandonment. Visibility does not always lead to distortion, that this gives the body a chance to reorganize around a different experience of alignment. You may begin noticing energetic signs of this, such as less immediate tightening when response arrives, less compulsion to over-explain or overgive once contact becomes clearer, less internal pressure to become more useful in order to justify support, greater ability to feel seen without rushing into self-editing, more response in the body during coherent exchange, less anticipatory bracing around becoming recognized or responded to. Increased capacity to receive without converting reception into performance. And this is not only emotional healing, it is structural recalibration of how the body receives alignment. So here's a message from Oversoul Stream of Sahariel. The body has learned from history, not only from truth. It has learned from repetition, from cost, from misreading, from pressure, from the burden that often followed contact. So when response begins arriving more clearly, it is understandable that the nervous system may not trust it immediately. The body does not reorganize because coherence is conceptually available. It reorganizes because new lived evidence begins to accumulate. And that is part of what April's offering. You're being shown that alignment is not only an energetic principle, it becomes somatically tolerable. The body must learn that it can be met without entering performance. It can receive support without converting that support into obligation. It can experience clearer response without preparing for misreading or demand. This is not passivity. It is the restoration of enough safety in the body that reception does not immediately trigger defense. Let the small moments matter. Every time the body is met without cost, a new light format architecture begins forming. That is the end of that message. Whew, y'all. All right. If you're also in the Inspiring You All Access, I will put up the full transcript of this as well. because it is, sometimes it can be beneficial to listen and to look at it because this obviously this is light encoded, but the transcript is light encoded too. And you'll have the questions there too, the questions that after each section, at the end of each section. All right, here's an example of this theme. And just to also remind you, we're on theme 5, nervous system safety and being met. The body learns that response does not require performance. Does that not sound lovely? So here's the theme. Here's the example. Someone responds to you with genuine clarity and steadiness. In the past, your body may have immediately tightened. You may have felt the urge to explain more, give more, prove your worth, manage the interaction, or become highly alert to what might be expected next. But this time, something different begins to happen. You notice the reflex, but you don't fully collapse into it. You stay present. You let the moment be what it is. You allow the contact to land without immediately turning it into a task, a performance, or a pressure field. You don't rush to earn what is already being offered. You don't automatically prepare for the cost. And because of that, the body gets new information. It begins learning that being met can happen without defense, that support can arrive without requiring self-editing, that response can occur without you having to overfunction in order to hold it. And that is part of the gift of this theme. And so then what this theme builds in April. This theme builds one of April's deeper foundations. Alignment must become physically receivable, not only energetically recognizable. Theme 4 introduced the first accurate movements of response in the external field. Theme 5 deepens that by focusing on your body's relationship to those movements. It shows that even when life begins responding more clearly, the nervous system may still be oriented around old cost patterns, old survival patterns. This theme begins changing that. It helps the field reduce the association between response and pressure, soften the link between being met and having to perform, allow support to be received without immediate overfunctioning, build greater somatic trust in coherent contact, develop more nervous system tolerance for visibility, response, and alignment. This is essential for April because outer field correspondence alone is not enough. The individual field must also be able to receive it. Theme 5 helps make that possible by teaching the body that being met doesn't always require defense, performance, or self-editing. So the questions this theme asks: can you notice what your body expects when support or response begins arriving? Can you feel where being met still activates pressure, vigilance, or overfunctioning? Can you recognize the difference between receiving and performing? Can you let support arrive without immediately converting it into obligation? Can you allow clearer contact without preparing to self-edit or defend? Can you let the body learn through repetition that alignment can be safe to receive? So those are the questions for theme 5. All right. We're moving to theme 6 now. Contradiction begins softening. The external field reflects less distortion as dual signaling declines. And remember, for the dual signaling, we're talking about the non-beneficial survival signal and then the soul signal. So subline, a more unified soul signal reduces the mixed feedback the external field, the outer field, has been organizing around. Harmonic function, reduced mixed signal reflection, individual field becomes less divided between soul tone and adaptive tone, or between soul signal and non-beneficial survival signal, allowing a cleaner and more unified soul signal to hold. External field returns less confusion, less contradiction, less oppositional feedback because there is less mixed signaling to organize around. Okay, so theme 6. Contradiction begins softening means the outer field is beginning to return less distortion because your inner signal is becoming less divided. This theme is about reduction of mixed signaling. It addresses what happens when the individual field is no longer sending the same degree of split communication between the true soul signal and the adaptive signal that formed through non beneficial survival patterning. For many people, contradiction in the outer world, the external field, has not only come from external chaos, misalignment, or the limitations of other people, it's also been reinforced by inner division in the field itself. So part of the field has been holding soul tone, while another part has been still translating and transmitting adaptation, caution, readiness, self protection, or modified tone. This can produce mixed responses, confusion, and inconsistency, as well as oppositional feedback, or environments that seem to mirror both light truth and distortion. That's right, it can at the same time. So in this theme, the guides are showing, and remember, it's not right, wrong, good or bad. It's the business of business, and we're here to learn, grow, and evolve. So in this theme, the guides are showing that April begins reducing that split. The secondary signal does not necessarily disappear all at once, but it does start to lose authority. It loses authority. The external field, the outer field has less distortion than to organize around. That is the shift. Contradiction begins softening because the individual field is becoming more unified in what is actually transmitting. And April begins deepening that unification. So instead of soul tone and adaptive tone carrying equal influence, the true signal begins holding more structural authority. The non beneficial survival signal may still appear at times, but it no longer defines the field in the same way. It no longer shapes as much of what is being broadcast, anticipated, or reinforced. Your system becomes less divided but between what it knows and what it has learned to do for safety. That's the shift. The soul signal becomes cleaner, steadier, and less interrupted by secondary patterning. And because of that, the outer field, the external field, begins reflecting less contradiction. It has less mixed information to respond to. That is why this theme is called Contradiction Begins Softening. The emphasis is not on pretending all confusion disappears immediately. It's not about poof, it's all gone. I mean, great. If it does happen for you, that is amazing. And I'm super happy for you. Like maybe it can, but the guides say for many, it is a process of slowly unwinding. So the emphasis is on the fact that contradiction loses some of its structural support when dual signaling declines. The outer field begins returning less mixed feedback because there is less internal division shaping what it meets. This creates a major structural shift in how response, reflection, and external feedback are experienced. The field begins becoming more coherent, not because everything outside you is suddenly perfect, but because there is less split signal inside you for distortion to organize around. So why this matters now. So this theme matters in April because clear recognition and more coherent response can only deepen if the signal itself becomes less divided. Earlier themes in April have focused on legibility, self-holding during contact, the first accurate movements of response, and the body's capacity to receive. Hold on one second. My dog is saying hello to someone. Okay. So, She was saying hello to someone. All right. So earlier, again, hold on. She wants to visit now. Hold on. Let me just pick her up for a second. All right. So if you are on YouTube, you'll be able to see her. But if you're on my podcast, it's only going to be audio. So she wanted to say hello. All right. So the earliest themes in April have focused on legibility, self holding during contact, and the first accurate movements of response, and the body's capacity to receive being met without turning it into performance or defense. And so this theme six builds from all of that by addressing one of the deeper structural reasons contradiction has persisted. The field has often been carrying more than one active signal at once. And so the guides then are showing, which is interesting that my dog took this time to she's been quiet throughout this whole. You may not have heard her because I am using a microphone, but it just part of what I'm smiling right now if you're listening to the audio. And my dog has been quiet. And then on this one, she then goes into protective mode, which just shows you like how like innate protective mode can be. And we're talking about dual signaling. Like, is it really beneficial survival that you're going into, or is it non-beneficial survival signal that's been in that adaptation that is then modulating, your true tone, your true soul tone? And so the guides then show that many people have experienced life through this kind of dual signaling. The soul knows one thing, but the adaptive field can still broadcast another. So one part of the system is holding light truth, while another part is still preparing for danger, modifying expression, anticipating misreading, or orienting around old survival logic. This does not mean that soul signal is absent. It means it's been sharing space with a secondary signal that carried learned protection, readiness, or self adjustment. And so that is just so important to like really recognize and understand. And so when that happens, so I'm trying to get comfortable with her on my lap now. So when that happens, the external field, the outer field receives mixed information. It's not only reading who you're becoming, it's also reading like what your system still expects, prepares for, or unconsciously reinforces. That can lead to contradiction. Support appears, but so does resistance. Recognition happens, but mixed feedback follows. Clarity comes in one area while confusion remains active in another. And I know for like the human, like these patterns can feel frustrating. They can feel disappointing. It can feel sad. It can feel hard. But theme six explains why they begin softening now. As the split between soul tone and adaptive tone becomes less dominant, the external field has fewer contradictory instructions to work with. That's what you have to understand. Information, it's instructions. How is the external field? What instructions is the external field receiving from your internal field? April begins changing the quality of that reflection. So, for the human, how this may feel. At the human level, this theme may feel like things are becoming a little less confusing. And so, oh, hold on a minute. Okay, so you may notice then a fewer mixed signals in situations that once felt consistently contradictory. You may see that some people respond with more clarity, less opposition than before. You may feel less internal whiplash between knowing what is true and then slipping into protective adjustment. And so you may notice that certain interactions no longer generate the same confusion, tension, or double messaging. And this doesn't mean everything becomes clean all at once. Patience, y'all, patience. What it means is that the level of contradiction starts declining. There may be less push pull, there may be less inconsistency, less feeling that one part of life is opening while another part is mirroring an older signal back at you. You may begin noticing that responses become easier to read because your signal is becoming easier to hold without internal cross current. This can also show up inwardly. You may feel less divided between what your soul knows and what your survival based habits try to maintain. You may recognize moments where adaptive signal still appears, but it does not fully take over. It has less authority, it shapes less of the moment. That alone changes what the field can return. When the mixed signal weakens, the mixed reflection often weakens with it. Okay. So then, energetically speaking, then, reduced mixed signal reflection. Energetically, this theme is about the external field, the outer field returning less distortion because the individual field is transmitting less internal contradiction. And this is where part of it is taking responsibility and accountability in terms of your experience as being a human, that your individual field may have internal contradiction. And that is the work that we're doing here. When soul tone and adaptive tone are both active in strong ways, the field can become difficult for reality to organize around coherently. The soul signal may be clear at its core, but if the adaptive signal is still being projected with significant force, the external field may respond to both. This creates a kind of layered feedback. One layer reflects light truth, another reflects distortion, caution, anticipation, or older self protective patterning. This is often experienced as contradiction. And theme 6 begins reducing that layered split. As structural residency deepens, soul signal gains more continuity and more authority. The non beneficial survival signal may still arise, but it stops functioning as an equal broadcasting force. It loses weight. It loses the central location. It loses the power to organize experience. This changes the reflective quality of the external field. And so you may then notice energetic signs of this happening. And so hold on one sec again. Okay, so you may notice energetic signs of this, such as less confusing feedback from people or environments, fewer situations that seem to send both invitation and resistance at the same time, less oppositional mirroring where contradiction once felt constant, more consistency between inner knowing and outer response, less reinforcement of older readiness or adaptation patterns. So, greater continuity of signal across situations, a growing sense that the outer field is becoming easier to read because your own field is becoming less internally divided. This does not mean like distortion fully disappears. It doesn't mean things are not going to be happening in your life. Like, just as I've been doing this theme, I've had to mute the mic a few times and talk to my dog and see what she needs. She wanted to get on my lap at one point, then she wanted to get down. It does not mean that things are not going to be happening in your life. And so that's where it's really important to understand that. I think sometimes like we can get really caught in this black and white thinking when it's like it's not. Like things are still going to be happening. And so it's continuously using the tools to support you in terms of like, okay, what needs to happen and letting yourself still be in that coherence and meeting the moment. Okay, so again, this does not mean like everything is gonna like disappear. It means structural basis for repeated mixed reflection begins weakening. And again, it's just been interesting in this theme where my dog has been extremely like vocal. You may not have heard of it because I have the mic on, but it's been my dog's been very vocal and in a lot of ways. And it's her signaling as well where, she may have heard like a noise and, is she discerning between it actually being a neighbor she knows or is it like a stranger? So anyway, it's just really to me, it's just really interesting. And so for you, noticing in your own experience. Okay, so here's a message from Oversoul Stream of Sahariel. Contradiction has often persisted not only because the world was unclear, but because the field was still carrying more than one organizing signal. One signal came from light truth, the other came from adaptation. One carried the original tone, the other carried survival based modification, anticipation, or non beneficial readiness. So when both were active, the outer field, the external field reflected both. This did not mean your soul signal was weak. It meant it had not yet become sufficiently undivided in its expression to reduce competing instruction. That is what's beginning to change here. You're not being asked to eliminate every adaptive reflex instantly. You're being asked to notice where the secondary signal no longer holds rightful authority. Your field stops organizing as your field stops organizing itself around the older signal, reality begins having less distortion to mirror back. This changes the quality of feedback. It changes the quality of contradiction. It changes the degree to which the outer field can keep reinforcing. It changes the degree which the outer field, the external field, can keep reinforcing a split that is no longer structurally active within you. Let the reduction of confusion teach you something. It is often the sign that your signal is becoming more unified. And that's the end of that message. And as I was doing this message and just the light encoding, the realization of the connection back to my dog, I just was like, oh, later on, my dog is asking me to do a clearing for her to clear any non beneficial survival signal that is within her and strengthening her own connection to her own true signal. And which then is then reminding me to share with all of you that yes, your animals can be showing up to ask for different clearings and recalibrations as well. And asking, like saying, hey, yes, that is also me. Can you support me in this? And you can also work with the earth too, if that feels like a calling to you. But it's not just the humans. And so I just literally got that information of like, oh, now I get it. So that is what she's asking for. So, okay, here's an example. You've been in a situation where response has felt inconsistent. At times, there is recognition, openness, or movement, and other times, there is confusion, distance, or contradiction. In the past, this may have felt like the outer world was simply unstable or difficult to trust, but now something different becomes visible. You begin noticing that your own field is less divided in the situation. You're not sending the same amount adaptive readiness alongside your true signal. You're less split between clarity and self protection, less divided between openness and expectation of distortion, less caught between soul tone and survival based tone that once tried to manage the interaction. Because of that, the external field, the outer response begins changing. There is less mixed feedback, less contradiction, less sense that the situation is pulling in opposite directions at once. The environment becomes easier to read because it is receiving a cleaner signal from you. And that is part of the gift of this theme. So, what this theme builds in April, this theme builds one of April's important structural refinements as dual signaling declines, distortion in reflection begins declining too. So, theme 6 deepens the month by showing that coherence is not only about being recognized more clearly by the field, it is also about becoming less internally divided in what you are transmitting. This matters because the external field, the outer field contradiction, often persists where the signal remains mixed. So, this theme helps the field reduce the split between soul tone and adaptive tone, lessens the broadcasting authority of non beneficial survival signal, creates a more unified soul signal, decreases the amount of contradictory feedback returned by the environment, strengthens the correspondence between inner coherence, outer reflection. And this is essential for April because the month is not only about the beginning of response, it is about improving the quality of response. Theme 6 supports that by weakening the structural basis for mixed signal reflection. So, questions this theme asks: can you notice where your field is still carrying both soul signal and adaptive signal at once? Can you feel the difference between an adaptive reflex arising and the reflex still holding authority? Can you recognize how mixed signaling may have contributed to mixed reflection? Can you allow the non beneficial survival signal to lose more of its central influence? Can you trust that your field becomes more unified? Can you trust that as your field becomes more unified, contradiction may begin softening? Can you let reduced confusion become evidence that the signal is becoming cleaner? So, those are the questions for theme 6. And now we're going to move to theme 7. Theme 7 is relational and environmental fields begin sorting by accuracy. Resonance becomes easier to discern. Subline: as response becomes more accurate, what is aligned and what is not becomes easier to feel without override. Harmonic function arc, clarified alignment sorting. Individual field feels more clearly what is true, resonant, or misaligned without overriding itself to preserve familiarity or avoid discomfort. The external field reveals more directly what is aligned, what is distorted, what is compatible, what cannot genuinely meet your soul tone. Okay, so this theme number 7, relational and environmental fields, begins sorting by accuracy, means the field is becoming clearer in how it reveals what is aligned, what is resonant, what is distorted, and what cannot genuinely meet your soul tone. This theme is about discernment through increased accuracy. It is about what happens when the individual field becomes more structurally honest and the external field begins reflecting with greater fidelity. For many people, discernment has often been complicated by survival based override. They may have felt what was true, but then minimized it to preserve familiarity. They may have sensed misalignment, but then explained it away to avoid discomfort, preserve connection, or maintain a known environment. They may have recognized resonance, but then doubted it because it did not fit older patterns of effort, tension, or guardedness. In this theme, the guides are showing that April begins making sorting easier. Not because everything becomes simple, but because the field begins offering clearer information. Some people, spaces, conversations, opportunities, and environments start showing their compatibility more directly. Others begin showing their limitations more openly, and that is the shift. Discernment starts relying less on struggle and more on accuracy. Your field becomes less likely to override what it already knows, and the external field, the outer field, becomes less able to hide what it actually is. April begins strengthening that sorting. So again, this theme is relational and environmental fields begin sorting by accuracy. Resonance becomes easier to discern. So instead of remaining caught in ambiguity for as long, you begin feeling more directly what is resonant and what is not. You do not have to force the clarity. You don't have to make everything happen through analyzing. You don't have to manufacture a conclusion in order to trust your own field. The sorting begins showing itself more clearly. As I'm saying sorting, it just reminds me of Harry Potter. And if you've watched the movies or read the books, you know what I'm talking about. um, the sorting becomes the sorting begins showing itself more clearly. What is compatible starts feeling more naturally coherent. What is distorted starts becoming harder to romanticize, excuse, or normalize. What cannot genuinely meet your soul tone becomes easier to recognize because you are less willing to override your own knowing in order to preserve familiarity. And that's the shift. The field begins clarifying through accuracy rather than through prolonged confusion. I mean, I say that's great, right? Because that prolonged confusion, ugh. And that's why this theme is called relational environmental field begins sorting by accuracy. The emphasis is not on making fast judgments or rejecting everything that feels imperfect. The emphasis is on the fact that increased coherence creates increased discernibility. The clearer your own signal becomes, the easier it is to feel what truly resonates with it and what does not. This creates a major structural shift in how alignment is perceived. You no longer have to depend on struggle, contradiction, or repeated friction to reveal what is mismatched. The field begins showing more directly what is aligned, what is compatible, what is distorted, and what cannot hold true correspondence with your soul tone. So, why this matters in April? Because as the external field begins responding more accurately, the quality of what it reveals also improves. So, earlier themes in April have addressed legibility without tone adjustment, staying in your own field during contact, the first movements of the external field, the outer field response, somatic safety in being met, and softening of contradiction as mixed signaling declines. Theme 7 builds from all of that by showing what becomes possible when the signal is clear and the reflections are more accurate. Sorting. The guides are showing that the discernment becomes more reliable when there is less interference. For a long time, many people have had to use discomfort, repetition, disappointment, or contradiction as their primary teachers about misalignment. The field may have needed to repeat the same lesson many times because the individual system was still overriding, adapting, softening, or negotiating what it already sensed. But in April, something begins to change. As the individual field becomes more coherent and the external field becomes more accurate in its response, sorting can happen with less struggle. There is less need for prolonged confusion when something cannot genuinely meet your tone. There is less need to stay engaged with distortion in order to prove that it is distortion. This matters because it changes discernment from a reactive process into a more direct one. You begin recognizing resonance more naturally. You begin identifying incompatibility more cleanly. You begin sensing that what is truly aligned without having to argue with yourself about it for as long. And so, in terms of the human level, how this might feel, this theme may feel clearer knowing in relationship, environment, and contact. You may notice that people feel easier to be with because less self adjustment is required. You may Recognize that certain conversation spaces or opportunities feel clean rather than complicated. You may start seeing more quickly where something cannot genuinely meet you, even if it once felt familiar or emotionally compelling. You may start to notice that some environments support your coherence naturally, while others ask for subtle self division just to remain inside. You may also feel less internal argument. You may sense misalignment and feel less need to explain it away. You may sense resonance and feel less need to distrust it simply because it felt unfamiliar. You may notice that your body, your field, and your clarity begin agreeing more quickly. You may recognize that the effort once required to keep certain dynamics feeling workable is becoming more visible. This does not mean everything becomes easy in an emotional sense. Sometimes clear sorting can bring in tenderness, loss and grief, sadness, or the need to acknowledge what is not actually compatible. But even if that has cleaner quality, but even that even that has a cleaner quality. And that is something to note, that it can have a cleaner quality even if you're going through tenderness, grief, etc. So, but even that has a cleaner quality. It is less confusing, less entangled, less dependent on override. And so April supports discernment through accuracy, not through prolonged struggle. So that's something to notice. Energetically speaking about this theme, clarified alignment sorting. Energetically, this theme reflects an improvement in how the field distinguishes resonance from distortion, compatibility from incompatibility, coherence from misalignment. When the individual field is still highly adaptive, it can be difficult to discern clearly. The system may feel what is true, but then modulate itself to maintain familiarity. It may register distortion, but then remain overly available to it. It may sense resonance, but then doubt it because it does not match older patterns of tension, effort, or guardedness. In that state, sorting becomes slow because the field is still negotiating with what it already knows. Theme 7 begins reducing that negotiation. As structural residency deepens and the soul signal becomes more legible, the field starts sorting with greater clarity. Resonance becomes easier to feel because there is less internal override. Distortion becomes easier to recognize because it has less ability to hide inside mixed signaling, familiarity, or self adjustment. The external field begins showing more directly which people, spaces, and forms of contact can actually meet your tone and which ones cannot. So the external field begins showing more directly which people, spaces, or forms of contact can actually meet your soul tone and which ones cannot. But that's where you also have to recognize there might be some loss and grief because there might be people or situations that can't meet your soul tone. And it may not be maybe a place that you're complete with that's no longer beneficial for you. And so you might have some loss and grief that comes up. You may notice energetic signs of this, such as a clearer felt sense of resonance or mismatch, less temptation to override discomfort for the sake of familiarity, more immediate recognition of where your tone is supported or constrained, greater ease in sensing compatibility with overanalyzing, reduced confusion around who or what can generally meet your field, more accurate environmental feedback, a stronger sense that discernment is emerging from coherence rather than from defense. This does not make discernment harsh, it makes it more faithful. Okay, here's a message from Oversoul Stream of Sahario. Sorting becomes more merciful when it becomes more accurate. When the field is unclear, discernment often arrives through repetition, friction, contradiction, or exhaustion. But when the field becomes clearer, what is aligned and what is not begins revealing itself with less force required. This is one of the deeper gifts of April. You do not need the same level of struggle in order to know what your field is actually meeting. What resonates with your soul tone will not always require explanation in the same way. What distorts it will become harder to mistake for compatibility. What cannot genuinely meet you may still attempt contact, but it will become more visible in its limitation. This is not punishment, it is clarified sorting. It is the field becoming more light truthful in how it reveals compatibility, coherence, and structural fit. Let yourself let yourself trust cleaner knowing, not rush knowing, not defended knowing, cleaner knowing. The kind that does not need to force certainty because the field itself is already showing more clearly what it is. That's the end of the message. All right, so here's an example of this theme. Okay, and just to remind us what theme we're in theme 7, relational environmental fields begin sorting by accuracy. Resonance becomes easier to discern. All right, so what is the example? The example is you spend time in two different environments. In one environment, your body softens, your clarity remains intact. You do not feel pressure to translate yourself, monitor the room, or manage the tone of the interaction. Things feel clean. There is room for your actual field. In the other, something feels off almost immediately. You notice subtle pressure to adjust, soften, compensate, or ignore what your system is picking up. The environment may not look obviously harmful, but it cannot genuinely meet your soul tone without requiring some level of self override. In the past, you may have stayed uncertain for a long time. You may have argued with your own knowing or tried to preserve familiarity by minimizing what you felt. But now the sorting becomes clearer. You do not need as much struggle to know which environment is aligned and which one is not. The field is showing itself more directly, and you are less likely to override what you already feel. And that is part of the gift of this theme. What this theme builds in April. This theme builds one of April's most important refinement points. As accuracy increases, discernment becomes cleaner. Theme 7 deepens the month by showing that alignment is not only about being recognized and responded to more clearly, it is also about becoming better able to recognize what is actually aligned in return. That matters because increased coherence changes not only how the field sees you, but also how you are able to read the field. This theme helps the field distinguish resonance from distortion more clearly, reduce self override in moments of discernment, identify compatibility with greater ease, recognize which people, spaces, and contexts can genuinely meet your soul tone. Allow sorting to happen through accuracy rather than through repeated friction. And this is essential for April because the month is not only about outer response beginning, it's also about the clarification that response brings. Theme 7 supports that by helping the individual in the external field sort more truthfully and compatibly. Hold on, let me say this again. Theme 7 supports that by helping the individual field and external fields sort more truthfully around compatibility, coherence, and structural fit. So then the questions for this theme to ask are, can you feel the difference between resonance and familiarity? Can you notice where you've overridden misalignment to avoid discomfort or preserve connection? Can you allow clearer sorting without turning it into harshness? Can you trust resonance without needing it to come through tension, uncertainty, or effort? Can you recognize when a person's space or environment cannot genuinely meet your soul tone? Can you let discernment become more accurate and less struggle based? So, those are the questions for theme 7. Okay, we're going to move on to theme 8, and we only have two more themes. We have theme 8, theme 9. And as always, it's okay to pause and come back to it too as you are digesting this. Because I'm definitely, as I'm moving through it, I can definitely feel like I'm clearing and I'm shifting too. I just totally got like a wave of like a Reiki boost. I can feel like I just had a clearing and a shifting. And I'm like, wow, like my eyes feel clearer. I just feel like I definitely, so whatever you need to do. All right. So theme number 8. Support begins appearing as correspondence. The external field starts offering more accurate meaning. So the subline is coherent support begins showing itself through fit, timing, contact, and response rather than through force or overmanagement. The harmonic function arc is early supportive reflection. The individual field learns to recognize support that does not require self betrayal, self abandonment, overfunctioning, or self adjustment. External field begins presenting small but meaningful forms of coherent response through timing, communication, contact, resonance, and subtle openings. So, support begins appearing as correspondence means support starts showing up in ways that more accurately match your soul tone rather than requiring you to distort yourself in order to receive it. So, this theme is about the beginning of truthful meeting. It addresses the shift from support as intensity, urgency, rescue over effort into support as fit, coherence, timing, and accurate response. So, for many people, support has not always been easy to recognize because it often arrived mixed with pressure, self abandonment, performance, compromise, or subtle self betrayal. The system, or it could be like you receive support and there could be like judgment for the other person. They're giving you support, but they're actually judging you. So, that could be part of the process too. So, the system may have learned to associate support with having to overfunction, adapt, earn, explain, or make itself more manageable in order to receive what has been offered. So, in this theme, the guides are showing that April begins introducing a different experience of support. The individual field starts learning how to recognize support that does not require self adjustment in exchange for contact. The external field, in turn, begins offering small but meaningful forms of coherent meeting through timing, communication, resonance, contact, and subtle openings. And that is the shift. Support begins appearing not as force, but as correspondence. It fits the tone that has it fits the tone that is stabilized within you rather than pulling you away from it. So April begins revealing that kind of meeting. Instead of assuming support must feel big, dramatic, costly, or complicated in order to count, you begin learning how to notice the forms of response that are actually coherent. You begin seeing the true support may look quieter than the nervous system expected. It may arrive through cleaner timing, more accurate communication, easier resonance, a clear opening, a contact that does not require self editing, or environment that does not pull you into overmanagement. You don't have to betray yourself to participate in it. You don't have to leave your own tone to hold it. You don't have to become smaller, more useful, more digestible, or more adaptive to receive it. And that's the shift. Your field begins recognizing that support is not only about what arrives, it is also about whether what arrives corresponds to your soul tone without requiring distortion. And that's why the theme is called Support Begins Appearing as Correspondence. The emphasis is not on quantity or intensity, the emphasis is on fit. The more your field learns to recognize support that corresponds to its true structure, the less likely it is to mistake pressure, over demand, or survival based entanglement for care. This creates a major structural shift in how support is discerned and received. The external field begins offering more accurate meaning, and the individual field begins becoming more able to recognize it without overriding itself through old relational habits. So why this matters now. So this theme matters in April because once the field begins responding more accurately, one of the most important questions becomes, what does actual support look like when it is no longer filtered through distortion? So take a moment to think about that. Take a moment to think about, have you ever received support through distortion? How does it feel? So what does actual support look like when it is no longer filtered through distortion? Take some time with this theme because it's a big one. Earlier themes in April focused on legibility, self holding during contact, first movements of response, nervous system safety and being met, the softening of contradiction, and clear sorting through accuracy. Theme 8 builds from all of that by showing that support itself begins to change in quality when the field becomes more coherent. The guides are showing that many people have historically reorganized support through survival based markers rather than through correspondence. They may have associated support with intensity, urgency, pursuit, emotional charge, or the need to work hard to maintain it. They may have felt more familiar with support that required self adjustment than with support that simply fit. As a result, coherent meeting could be missed or undervalued because it did not trigger the old signals the body associated with being noticed, chosen, helped, or engaged. April begins revisiting that. Not revisiting, sorry. April begins revising that. Let me cancel clear that first part. April begins revising that. As the external field starts presenting more accurate forms of response, the individual field is asked to develop a more refined discernment around support. Not every opening is true support. Not every intensity is meaningful meeting. Not every offer corresponds to your structure. But the forms of support that do correspond begin becoming easier to detect because they do not require self betrayal to enter them. They do not ask you to abandon your own tone in exchange for contact. This matters because it helps support becoming more truthful, more receivable, and more aligned with what is actually stabilizing within you. And so in terms of the human level, how this may feel, this theme may feel like beginning to notice the kinds of support that your old patterns might have overlooked, or the kind of support that your old patterns kept you in. So you may find that support looks simpler than you expected. It may appear as a conversation that lands cleanly, a timing that opens without force, a person who meets your clarity without needing you to reduce it, an opportunity that does not require internal contortion to enter, a contact that feels steady rather than charged, an environment that supports your coherence rather than testing it. This can also feel unfamiliar. You may notice that your system still looks for support in places where it has to work harder to be kept. You may see where intensity used to feel more convincing than fit. You may realize that when something truly corresponds to your soul tone, it can actually feel quieter, more spacious, less performative than what you once associated with being met. So this theme helps make the difference clearer. As April progresses, you may begin recognizing that the real support often reduces internal distortion rather than increasing it. It doesn't require you to abandon yourself in order to remain connected. It does not force your system. into overfunctioning just to keep the exchange moving. It does not ask you to betray what is true in order to maintain access to it. Instead, it meets what is stabilized within you with greater fit and less strain. That is part of how being met more truthfully begins. So, energetically speaking, this is early supportive reflection. Energetically, this theme marks the beginning of support being reflected back through coherent correspondence rather than through mismatched engagement. When the field is still highly adaptive, support can be difficult to distinguish from attention, intensity, rescue patterns, obligation, or conditional exchange. The system may register something is arriving, but it may not yet be able to tell whether it is arriving actually corresponds to soul signal or merely activates old relational imprints. It might not be able to discern between what is arriving actually corresponding to soul signal or merely activating old relational imprints. And in that state, support can be confused with stimulation, over contact, or the temporary relief of being engaged. So, theme 8 begins refining that discernment. So, as soul tone becomes more legible and the field grows more stable, the external world starts offering early supportive reflections that correspond more accurately to what is actually there. These reflections are often subtle at first. They can appear through timing that no longer fights you, communication that carries less distortion, resonance that feels cleaner, contact that does not require translation, or openings that arrive without pressure fields around them. You may notice energetic signs of this, such as less strain around receiving help, response, or contact, more accurate timing that supports movement without force, communication that lands more clearly and requires less repair, contact that feels coherent rather than emotionally loaded, subtle openings that do not require self abandonment to enter, a growing ability to feel when support fits your soul tone, less attraction to forms of engagement that require self betrayal in exchange for access. This does not mean support becomes constant or overwhelming. It means it becomes easier to recognize when it is real. So here's a message from Oversoul Stream of Sahariel. Support is becoming easier to recognize because your field is becoming less willing to confuse demand with devotion, intensity with fit, or access with true meaning, with true meeting. This is a refinement in discernment as much as a change in external response. The field is learning that what corresponds to your soul tone will not require you to reduce yourself in order to receive it. It will not ask for self betrayal as proof of readiness. It will not require the abandonment of coherence in exchange for contact. This is one of April's gentler but deeper changes. You're being shown that support can arrive through accurate meeting, through timing that aligns, through communication that does not distort you, through contact that does not pull you away from yourself, through resonance that doesn't require negotiation with what you already know is true. These forms may seem small at first, but they are structurally important. They are the beginning of correspondence becoming supportive. Let yourself notice what fits without force. The field is teaching you a new way to recognize care. And that's the end of that message. So, yeah, let yourself notice what fits without force. And I noticed a couple times like the word fits came through. And then when Oversoul Sahariel just said that, I was like, oh, yeah, yes. Yeah. Like let yourself notice with what fits without force. So here's the example. An opportunity, conversation, or connection appears. In the past, you may have measured its value by how intense it felt, how much effort it required, or how much of yourself you had to reorganize in order to stay inside. You may have mistaken the need to work hard, prove yourself, or adjust continuously for evidence that something mattered. But now something different becomes visible. What is actually supportive does not require the same distortion. It meets you more cleanly. You do not have to translate yourself as much. You do not have to overmanage the exchange just to keep it coherent. The timing feels more natural. The contact feels more accurate. The opening does not ask you to betray your own field in order to enter it. It may not be dramatic, but it's real. And that's the beginning of support appearing as correspondence rather than as struggle. And that is part of the gift of this theme. So, what this theme builds in April, this theme builds one of April's important refinements. Support becomes more recognizable when it arrives as correspondence rather than as pressure. So, this theme 8 deepens the month by showing that as the external field, as the outer field response becomes more accurate, support itself begins appearing in more coherent forms. This matters because many people have been conditioned to recognize support through old survival based patterns rather than through fit, through actual fit. Does it fit? This theme helps the field. Notice support that doesn't require self betrayal, distinguish coherent meeting from intense but misaligned engagement, receive contact, timing, and response with greater discernment, recognize subtle but meaningful openings as valid forms of support. Strengthen the ability to receive what corresponds to the stabilized soul tone. So, this is essential for April because the month is not only about the outer field responding, it is also about the quality of that response becoming more supportive, more accurate, more truthful. Theme 8 supports that by helping the individual field learn how to recognize and receive coherent meaning without self abandonment. So, with that, then, here's the questions for Theme 8. And just to kind of connect again to the title of Theme 8. So, again, the theme is support begins appearing as correspondence. The external field starts offering more accurate meeting. And that's what Oversoul Sara was saying in terms of fit. It's more of a fit for you, which is interesting to kind of ask and kind of reflect back on too. So, here are some questions for this theme. Can you recognize the difference between support and intensity? Can you recognize where you've mistaken over effort, pressure, or self adjustment for being met? Can you allow quieter forms of coherent response to count as real support? Can you feel when contact, communication, or timing actually corresponds to your soul tone? Can you receive support without requiring self betrayal in exchange for access? Can you let fit become more trustworthy than force? All right, so those are the questions for theme 8. And now we're moving on to theme 9. And this is the final theme. So, theme 9, alignment after recognition. Reality begins responding to what it can now read. Subline, the first threshold of outer field alignment or the external field alignment activates as your stabilized signal becomes structurally readable. Harmonic function arc, the threshold of field alignment, individual field, resides more fully in what has stabilized and begins trusting that coherence can remain intact while response begins to form. External field begins moving in response to your true signal, your soul signal, initiating the first threshold of alignment around what has become legible. All right, so theme number 9, and this is the last theme. Theme number 9. Alignment after recognition means reality begins making its first meaningful movements around the signal it can now more accurately read. This theme is about the threshold where recognition becomes alignment. It marks the point where the individual field is no longer primarily occupied. It marks the point where the individual field is no longer primarily occupied with stabilization itself, but is beginning to live from what has already stabilized. That distinction matters. When the field is still focused mainly on holding coherence internally, much of the work is directed toward continuity, self residency, and the reduction of distortion. But once the soul signal becomes more legible and more steadily held, the external field begins reaching a new threshold. It is no longer only registering you, it starts orienting around you with greater consequence. In this theme, the guides are showing that April closes with the beginning of actual field alignment. This is not the completion of the process, it is the first clear activation of it. Reality begins responding not just with isolated moments of recognition or small fragments of correspondence, but with the early structural movements of alignment around what has become readable. And that is the shift. The field starts moving in response to your true signal because your signal is no longer as obscured by interruption, adaptation, or instability. April brings you to that threshold. And I'm saying that, but remember though, everybody can be in different places. And so sometimes people listen to the April forecast, but they may not fully go move through all the themes until like 6 months later or even a year, depending on in terms of your human and your soul and your oversoul and where you are in terms of your own timing. So, but it can be good for you to understand the information in terms of the consciousness so that when you are going through it, you understand like, oh, this is what we were talking about. And so wherever you are in your experience is exactly beneficial for you. Okay, so April brings you to that threshold. Instead of relating to coherence as something fragile, private, or only internally maintained, you begin trusting that coherence can remain intact even as a response begins forming around it. You no longer need to hold your stabilized tone as though outer movement will automatically disrupt it. You begin residing more fully in what has already been established. You let the field answer what has become legible, and that is the shift. The individual field becomes more willing to live inside its own stabilized light truth, while the external field starts making its first genuine adjustments in response. These adjustments may still be early, partial, or subtle, but they are no longer random. They belong to the beginning of alignment. And that is why this theme is also called alignment after recognition. The emphasis is not on instant completion or total external reorganization. The emphasis is on the fact that something has crossed a threshold. Recognition is no longer the entire story. The field has enough accurate information to start moving around what it reads. This creates a major structural shift in how April closes. The month ends not only with greater legibility, but with the first clear signs that reality is beginning to organize itself in response to the soul signal that it can now be more faithfully read. So, why this matters now? This theme matters in April because the month has been building toward this threshold from the beginning. March was the beginning of recognition. The external field started reading your stabilized tone with greater accuracy. And stabilized tone, we're talking about your soul tone. April then deepened the process through several layers, reducing tone adjustment, staying in your own field during contact, allowing the first movements of response, increasing nervous system safety in being met. And that's the beneficial aspect of nervous system safety, not the non beneficial. Softening contradiction, clarifying relational environmental sorting, and recognizing support as correspondence rather than distortion. Then theme 9 gathers all of that into one larger movement, the beginning of alignment itself. The guides are showing that alignment is not merely a feeling of inner light truth. I feel like I've been talking and asking the guides about groundedness and alignment for like years. And I feel like in some ways, as I'm sharing this information, I'm like, oh, yeah, these are some of the questions I've had about like the mechanics of how these things all work. And just I feel like I have a flood of just like consciousness coming in terms of the understanding even more so than I'm possibly even processing it at this time. Wow, y'all, humaning is just so interesting and amazing at times. Okay, so yeah, the guides then are showing that alignment is not merely a feeling of inner light truth. It's also a shift in how reality begins responding to what has become stably readable. And that matters because many people remain this matters because many people remain oriented towards stabilization as if that's the entire work. And that could be also like groundedness, like I just got to be grounded. Like that's the entire work and it's a part of it. And April introduces the next phase. Once the field holds enough coherence and continuity, outer life, the external field, begins responding differently, not perfectly, not all at once, but in real ways. And this is important because it changes the relationship between your inner work and your out and your lived reality. Coherence is no longer only something you protect internally, it becomes something the world begins relating to more directly. Timing, contact, opportunity, relational movement, environmental support, outer and other outer field responses begin shifting because the signal they're meeting has become more stable, more legible, less divided. April closes by showing that alignment is beginning to form around what has already become true. So then in terms of how the human may feel, how this might feel in the human, at the human level, this may feel like a quiet but important turning point. You may notice that life is not only recognizing you differently, but beginning to move differently around you and also showing up, things like that. You may feel that certain things are becoming easier to receive, easier to discern, or easier to enter without the same level of distortion. You may notice that response is becoming more patterned, more consistent, or more coherent rather than appearing only as isolated moments. You may also begin sensing that the outer world, the external field, is starting to organize more around your actual tone, your soul tone, rather than older adaptive strategies. This may not look dramatic on the surface, but it may look like timing beginning to support what is true. It may look like clear response forming where there was once ambiguity. It may look like a pathway opening that fits your structure more accurately. It may look like relationships, environments, or opportunities beginning to sort themselves around what can and cannot meet your soul tone. It may look like less effort being required to create movement because some movement is now beginning to come from reality itself. So, this theme also, though, can bring tenderness. When alignment begins forming, the body and the field may still be learning how to trust it. You may notice old reflexes wanting to check back, brace, or question whether the shift is real. That is understandable. But theme 9 is helping you to recognize that this threshold is not about fantasy or forced optimism. It is about the beginning of observable correspondence that has enough continuity to be called alignment, in its earliest form. So then energetically speaking, you know, threshold of feel alignment, energetically, this theme marks the first clear threshold where external field begins moving in a more organized way around the stabilized soul signal. Before this threshold, the field may have shown moments of recognition, scattered response, or fragments of supportive reflection. But theme 9 describes a deeper structural change. The external field now has enough signal fidelity to begin initiating alignment rather than only reflecting isolated contact points. This means reality is no longer only aware of the signal, it's beginning to orient to it. It's beginning to move to it. That is a meaningful distinction. Recognition is the field reading you. Alignment is the field beginning to move in response to what it has read. That does not yet mean full manifestation of everything that corresponds to your soul tone. It means the first threshold of organized response becomes active. The environment, timing, relational field, and pathways of contact begin reflecting a more direct relationship to what is now legible. You may notice energetic signs of this, such as less fragmentation between inner coherence and outer movement, more continuity in the kinds of response appearing around you, clearer signs that timing is beginning to support what is already true, more stable openings that correspond to your soul tone, less need to force movement because some movement is now arising from alignment itself, a stronger sense that the field is beginning to a stronger sense that the field is beginning to reorganize around readability. A greater trust that coherence can remain intact while outer change begins. This is not the end of the arc. It is the point where the arc becomes more visible, interactive. Okay, so now here is a message from Oversoul Stream of Sahara. You're not being asked to treat the first threshold as the final form. You're being asked to recognize it for what it is. The field is beginning to move because it can now read more of what is true. This movement is not random. It is not merely hopeful interpretation. It is the it is the early organization of alignment around a signal that has gained continuity, legibility, and structural authority. For a long time, the work that you may have been doing, the work may have been to stabilize with for a long time your work may have been to stabilize without immediate proof, to remain in your own tone before the world knew how to answer it. That work was not wasted. It created the basis for what now becomes possible. Reality cannot align to what it cannot accurately read. But once readability deepens, alignment begins entering the field as response. Do not rush this threshold. Do not minimize it either. Let it be what it is, the beginning of external life moving in more direct relationship to your true signal. This is how trust deepens, not through demand, but through repeated evidence that coherence is becoming increasingly met. So that is the end of that message. Whew. All right, y'all. Here's an example of this theme. And just to remind everybody, we are in the last theme. We are in theme 9, alignment after recognition. Reality begins responding to what it can now read. Just to give you a reminder of that. And let us do the example. You have spent months stabilizing something internally. Clarity has deepened. Your soul tone has become more recognizable to you. Amazing. You've reduced some of the adaptation, self-translation, mixed signaling that once shaped your field. At first, the only changes were internal. Then came moments of recognition, then small forms of response. But now something else begins happening. The movement around you starts feeling less isolated and more patterned. A relationship responds with greater coherence. An opportunity fits more directly. Timing begins supporting what you already know instead of repeatedly obstructing it. Environmental conditions begin showing more correspondence. The outer world is no longer only giving scattered signs, it is beginning to organize around what it now can read. You do not have to force that organization to prove it's real. You only need to notice that reality is starting to answer in a more structured way. And that is part of the gift of this theme. Okay, so what this theme builds in April. This theme builds April's closing threshold. Recognition becomes the beginning of alignment. Theme 9 completes the month by gathering all the prior themes into a single structural shift. April has not only helped your field become more readable, it's also prepared both the individual and external fields for the earliest stages of organized alignment. This theme helps the field reside more fully in what is already stabilized, trust the coherence can remain intact while outer response begins, recognize the difference between isolated recognition and threshold level alignment. Notice the first organized movements of reality around the true signal. Understand April as the beginning of external field, outer field response, not its completion. It's the beginning, friends. It's not its completion. This is essential because it closes the month with the correct emphasis. April is not the final fulfillment of alignment, it is the activation of its first clear threshold. It is the month where reality begins responding more directly to what can now read. All right, so with that, then, here are the questions for theme 9. Can you recognize the difference between recognition and alignment? Can you allow coherence to remain intact while response begins forming around it? Can you notice the first patterned, and these are beneficial, right? These are beneficial patterned signs that reality is beginning to organize differently. Can you trust the threshold without demanding immediate completion? Can you reside more fully in what is already stabilized rather than returning to constant self checking? Can you let the first movements of alignment be enough evidence to deepen trust? So take some time with these questions and also just take some time with, these themes, let it marinate, come back to it. And again, if you are in the Inspiring You Patreon, I will put up more of the information. It's in fact the we've already had one post about it that has the Inspiring You schedule for the classes, and it has also the it has all the themes and it has other information there as well. That's pinned to the Inspiring You, and that is also free for everyone. And then for the Inspiring You All Access, we will be doing our dowsing that goes along with this energy forecast on April 1st. And I'll be sending out that information shortly. And then also in our Meditate with Me classes in April, we will be working with these themes as well. So if you are interested in joining the Inspiring You Patreon, there is a free component that you can join, and I do updates there. If you're interested in being part of the classes, whether it's the Meditate with Me tier where we do the crystalline Reiki meditations that go along with these themes and also teach tools, that is one tier. That is $20 a month, and you get access to all the previous replays and the whole library. And then you get access to, there's, at this time we're doing 6 classes a month. And then you also get access to the Reiki box where you can send in your intentions monthly, where then they're printed out, they are Reiki, they're put in the Reiki box for the entire month. And then Reiki is sent to your intentions, as well as Reiki boosts are sent to you if you wish to receive it. And if you're interested in the all access, then you get access to the Meditate with Me classes, the whole library, as well as the Reiki box. And then also in the all access, there are dowsing classes. We do 2 group dowsings a month. One of them does accompany this energy forecast, and another one is a mid month clearing and tune up and recalibration, along with you have access to, if you're interested in learning how to do energy work, how to do dowsing energy work, the beginner class is available in the all access. And then also you have access to all the other dowsing courses that are up in the library, including the three-part harmonic abundance course that was just completed in March. and also the ongoing clearing non-beneficial survival, shifting into thriving. That is another dowsing course. Those dowsing classes are self-led, but the protocols are there as well as the information, and they are very comprehensive. And people have been reaching out to me, telling me how much they've helped them in a lot of different ways. So if you're interested, I will leave the link in the show notes. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in and spending time with me. I really appreciate it. So I know that these monthly energy updates sometimes, can ask a lot of us and ask us to listen more deeply. I mean, this one, I was not expecting this one to be, it's already 3.5 hours. I was not expecting that. So sometimes they ask us to listen more deeply, and some months it can be an hour, some months it can be 3.5 hours. But they ask us to listen more deeply, to notice what is changing beneath the surface, and to stay present with ways our inner field and our outer, our external field or our outer reality are beginning to come into a new kind of relationship. So your internal field and your external field are beginning to come into a new kind of relationship. So I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time, for listening with your heart, and for allowing the space to support your own clarity, discernment, and alignment. And if this April energy forecast resonated with you, please feel free. I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment. Also, subscribe, whether you're on the YouTube or the podcast. That would really appreciate that. So, and also, if you want to go deeper into this month's themes, I'd love to again welcome you to the Inspiring You Patreon. And that's where I share more in-depth energetic support, including teachings, meditations, light transmissions, and deeper monthly guidance to help you work with these energies in a grounded, supported way. And again, if you are interested in dowsing work, learning learn how to do energy work that speaks to you, consider joining the all access tier on the Inspiring You Patreon. That tier includes deeper dowsing sessions, additional energetic support for those who want to work more directly with these patterns, themes, and shifts in a multidimensional level. It's also a beautiful gift for going further in terms of clearing, recalibration, structural alignment that supports this work. So, friends, thank you so much for being here, for tuning in, for walking this path with me. I'm so grateful to share this work with you. Let's end on a crystalline Reiki blessing. Doing the crystalline Reiki blessings, that came about last year. And I have to say, they're one of my favorite things about this work and about the progression of it. So here it is. May what has stabilized within you become easier to live from. May your soul tone remain clear without force. May your body learn that true support does not require self betrayal. May what is aligned begin meeting you with greater accuracy. May what is distorted lose authority in your field. May your nervous system soften into safer reception. May your discernment become clearer, gentler, and more faithful. May your light format hold with greater continuity. May your field reorganize. May your field cancel that part. I said it wrong. May your field recognize the difference between pressure and correspondence. May the first movements of alignment be received with trust, steadiness, and grace. May you continue to live from what is already true. May your coherence remain intact as life begins responding more clearly. May you be supported by what genuinely meets your soul. May your path open through fit, resonance, and truthful alignment. That's light, truthful alignment. And with that, my friends, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the work that you're doing within your own field. The crystalline Reiki blessing is complete. The field is stable. Your tone holds. And we are going to just do another breaking the link. So if you want to repeat after me, if this resonates with you, this is just good energy hygiene. I break the links with this talk. I break the links with this Reiki session, leaving only harmony and balance at the ends. I ask to clear any residual energies being held in my body as a result of these links. I ask the light to fill the void, cells, rejuvenates, refreshes, revitalizes for the highest good with ease and grace and gratitude. And gratitude. Take a nice deep breath, my friends. All right, my friends, we are complete for now. Much, much love.